Costing $5 billion to construct, the nuclear cruiser, Admiral Nakhimov, is the pride of the Russian Navy, packing enough firepower to wipe out entire cities or eliminate any vessel standing in its way. It's supposed to be one of the most formidable military vessels the world has ever seen, the kind of mega-military innovation that Russia's President Vladimir Putin loves to boast about. But it's been rendered almost entirely worthless by Ukraine's armed forces, without them even needing to fire a single shot. So here's the full story of the life and effective death of the Admiral Nakhimov. The story of the Admiral Nakhimov began before modern-day Russia even existed. It was on May 17, 1983, during the days of the Soviet Union, that this ship was laid down, with construction officially commencing at the Baltic shipyard in St. Petersburg, then known as Leningrad. It launched a few years later, on April 25, 1986, and was commissioned on December 30, 1988. Back then, it was known as the Kalinin, and it officially entered service with the Northern Fleet on April 21, 1989. It was renamed a few years later, in 1992, in honor of renowned Navy Admiral Pavel Stepanovich Nakhimov, who led the Imperial Russian Navy to a historic victory in the Battle of Sinop during the Crimean War in 1853. Constructed during the Cold War, this Kirov-class battlecruiser boasted extensive offensive and defensive capacities, and is the largest surface warship to have been constructed since the Second World War, not including aircraft carriers. It measures up at over 823 feet, 251 meters, with a beam just over 93 feet or 28.5 meters, a draft over 33 feet or 10.3 meters, and a maximum displacement of 28,000 tons when fully loaded. It was equipped with an extensive arsenal, described by the US intelligence community of the 1980s as having an array of weapons that makes it one of the most powerfully armed surface warships in the world. Those weapons included 20 P-700 Granite anti-ship missiles and launchers, 12 S-300F surface-to-air launchers with 96 missiles in total, and a pair of 4K-33 OSA-M surface-to-air missile batteries, with a total of 40 individual SAMs on board at any given time. The Nakhimov also boasted a twin 130mm AK-130 dual-purpose gun, a set of RBU-6000 and RBU-1000 anti-submarine missile launchers, 10 533mm torpedo tubes, and 6 Cortic close-in weapon systems. This made it strong enough to fulfill its primary objective of countering NATO submarines and carrier strike groups. It was also constructed with a helicopter landing pad and enough underdeck storage space to house up to 3 Kamov Ka-27 helicopters. In addition, despite its enormous size, it was able to exceed speeds of 30 knots or 34.5 miles per hour, thanks to a special engine system that made use of both steam and nuclear power, together with a pair of steam turbines connected to a KN-3 nuclear reactor, with an oil-fired boiler to provide additional power as and when required. Thanks to this system, the Nakhimov enjoyed near limitless range when operating at lower speeds, and a peak speed of 25 knots or 29 miles per hour while operating on nuclear power alone, which can push past the 30-knot mark with the use of an oil boiler. On top of all this, the Nakhimov had sufficient space on board for a crew of over 700 people. In short, it was a formidable vessel and a frightening prospect for any NATO force to encounter in open water. But after the Cold War came to an end in 1991, the Admiral Nakhimov slowly started to lose relevance. The years passed, and there was less need for justification for Russia to continue operating such an enormous, expensive warship. As such, the Nakhimov made fewer and fewer journeys, culminating with its final 20th century voyage in July 1997. In 1999, it was towed to Severodvinsk, initially to undergo repairs, which later turned into an extensive and extremely expensive renovation project. Over the course of more than 2 decades, the Nakhimov remained in situ at the Sevmash shipyard. Bit by bit, the vessel was brought up to modern standards, but the project wasn't without its problems. It ran over budget and over schedule, Indeed, on numerous occasions, officials like Sevmash director Nikolai Kalistratov claimed that the project would soon be complete and that the ship would re-enter service, but the Nakimov's renovation ended up taking almost a quarter of a century in total. It also cost a whopping 200 billion rubles, or around $5 billion, making it one of the most expensive military modernization programs of a single vessel ever recorded. Aimed at extending the service life of the vessel and making it more relevant and viable in modern combat conditions, the overhaul involved several major changes to the Nakimov's offensive arsenal. The outdated P-700 Granite anti-ship missile launchers, for example, were removed and dismantled, according to Russian sources, before being replaced with 80 universal UKSK 3S-14 launchers, which are capable of firing some of Russia's most powerful modern-day missiles like Kalibrs, Onyx, and Zircons. The project also involved the addition of new radar systems, improving the vessel's situational awareness capabilities, and a 130mm AK-192M naval gun. Other close-in weapons, guns, and anti-submarine rockets and torpedoes have also received iterative upgrades, and the ship's air defense battery has been modernized, with the latest S-400 system replacing the Cold War-era S-300. These improvements helped to bring the Admiral Nakimov into the 21st century, empowering it with long-range land attack capabilities. The Caliber cruise missiles, for example, which cost close to $1 billion each, can carry warheads weighing up to 1,100 pounds, 500 kilograms, and reach peak speeds of up to Mach 3, or 3 times the speed of sound, which is around 2,300 miles per hour. With multi-stage, solid-fuel designs and turbojet engines built in, some of these missiles had the power to strike targets around 1,550 miles or 2,500 kilometers away, and they've proven particularly effective during Russia's war with Ukraine. The Kremlin's forces have fired huge numbers of Caliber missiles at Ukrainian towns, cities, and military sites, leading to large numbers of deaths and injuries, along with extensive damage to buildings, ports, and valuable pieces of infrastructure. P-800 Onyx missiles, too, boast some impressive technical specifications, including an operational range of 370 miles or 600 kilometers, and maximum speeds of Mach 2.9 or 1,998 miles per hour. The Zircons, meanwhile, are the fastest of the three. Qualifying into the hypersonic category of missiles, they can reach top speeds of Mach 9 or almost 7,000 miles per hour, making them incredibly difficult to intercept and ensuring that any enemy force on the receiving end of a Zircon strike has barely any time at all to react and respond to it. With an effective operational range in excess of 620 miles or 1,000 kilometers, these missiles can deal devastating damage to targets near and far. With these additional armaments, the Nakimov nuclear-powered missile cruiser is stronger than ever before, at least on paper. And in 2025, after more than 25 years in the dry dock, this colossal battle cruiser began sea trials, with plans to reintroduce it to military service the following year. That news should and could have sent ripples of concern throughout the Ukrainian ranks, as a cruiser of this size and strength could potentially allow Russia to assert dominance in bodies of water like the Black Sea, while also giving the Kremlin another launch platform for its deadly missile strikes on Ukraine's towns, cities, military bases, and civilian sites. Russia, meanwhile, should have been proudly boasting about its new superpowered vessel, ready to rain down fire and destruction on its enemy and lead the charge towards a crushing and comprehensive victory in a war that's raged on far longer than anyone, even Vladimir Putin, ever anticipated. But that's not what happened. Instead, behind closed doors, Russian officials are believed to be second-guessing the costly decision to renovate the Nakimov in the first place, while Western analysts are labeling the entire project a massive waste of time and money. Ukraine, meanwhile, has managed to rewrite the rules of naval warfare so extensively that a big ship like this feels more like a costly, cumbersome burden than an invaluable piece of hardware. In other words, the new and improved Nakimov is nowhere near as deadly or devastating as it first appears, but is instead another costly reminder of Russia's outdated doctrines and diminishing military strength. 28,000 tons of dead weight, with little to no chance of playing any sort of decisive or instrumental role in the remainder of the war with Ukraine. But before we get into that, if this is the kind of insight you want more of, make sure you're subscribed to the Military Show. We break it down like this every week. On paper, the Admiral Nakhimov should be one of the most valuable and vital pieces of hardware in Russia's entire arsenal. It should be out there right now, taking up strategic positions in the Black Sea, carrying out ground-shaking missile strikes on high-value targets dotted across the Ukrainian territory. It should strike fear into the Ukrainian armed forces, while serving as a constant, unshakable reminder of Russia's rich military history and unparalleled strength. But it's not doing any of that. Why? Because times have changed. There was once an era when a colossus of a cruiser like this would have been an extraordinary military advantage, the pride of almost any navy in the world. For years, Russia has been talking about bringing the Nakhimov up to date and reintroducing it to military service, and for years, that was a frightening prospect for the country's enemies around the world. But not anymore. A gigantic cruise with modernized vertical launch systems and dozens of onboard missiles is no longer the threat it once was. Because this is no longer the era of vast warships dominating the ocean waves. It's the era of drones. Cheap, simple, but remarkably effective when it comes to dealing damage and wiping targets off the map. Drones have come to dominate the war between Russia and Ukraine, with the latter proving particularly effective at developing innovative, game-changing models capable of traveling both by air and sea to hunt down and eliminate any targets in their way. As naval expert and open-source intelligence analyst H.I. Sutton puts it in an article for Naval News, Ukrainian surface drones, USVs, present seemingly unwinnable defensive conundrums to the much larger Russian fleet in the Black Sea. So, as Ukrainian naval drones bottle up the Black Sea fleet in port, the Russian Navy has effectively saddled itself with a self-inflicted burden, desperately clinging to faded Cold War grandeur. Put another way, Russia still appears stuck in a bygone age, one in which record-breaking warships of staggering size and strength were the be-all and end-all of naval might, an age in which countries across the globe competed to build the biggest, fanciest ships with the latest and greatest missile launchers and air defense systems. But the truth of the matter is that age is over. Now, even the world's biggest and strongest military forces are moving away from constructing warships worth billions of dollars, instead putting more of their time and energy into drones and the platforms required to launch them. China, for example, has been working tirelessly to expand its array of uncrewed drone platforms in open water, and the US too is pouring a lot of money and manpower into constructing a naval drone fleet to keep up with its enemies in this increasingly important aspect of modern warfare. Russia, meanwhile, has thrown billions of dollars into modernizing a ship that no longer seems to have much of a place in the world today. As Sutton continues, the future of such large surface combatants in the age of uncrewed warfare seems increasingly questionable. Even before drones, concentrating so much money and firepower in a single hull was open to challenge, but now it's even more doubtful. While drones cannot currently perform all the roles of crewed vessels, the threat they create and the way that they're reshaping naval warfare is real. And Ukraine has led the way in that respect, consistently pushing and breaking the boundaries of drone warfare time and time again over the course of the conflict so far. There have been countless recorded instances of Ukrainian drone crews taking out high-value Russian naval assets. In late 2025, for example, the Ukrainian military made use of underwater drones to blow up a Russian Kilo-class submarine, which was docked in the Novorossiysk harbor at the time. The sub was estimated at around $400 million in value, while the kinds of drones used to destroy it are valued in the hundreds of thousands. This shows just how much more valuable it is, in this day and age, to have a strong selection of relatively low-cost drones to choose from, rather than a small array of enormously expensive warships. Often, all it takes is one or two well-placed drone hits for millions or even billions of dollars of military hardware to go up in smoke or sink to the bottom of the ocean depths. And there have been many other examples of this since 2022, with various Russian subs, landing craft, cruises, and other vessels struck, damaged, and even destroyed entirely by Ukrainian drones. It's even reached the point where Russia's commanders are scared to actually deploy their ships, including vessels like the Nakhimov, because they know that Ukrainian drone teams are scanning the seas and could easily launch precise, targeted attacks to take them out with ruthless precision and efficiency, all in the blink of an eye. In effect, Kyiv has sunk Russia's fleet without even needing to fire an actual shot. As Sutton notes, in the Black Sea, the Russian Navy is essentially confined to port due to the elusive yet persistent threat of Ukrainian surface drones. He goes on to note that even though these drones aren't actually as powerful as the likes of Onyx and Caliber missiles, they're still potent enough to deal game-changing damage, while also being small and agile enough to evade even the most sophisticated close-in defense systems used by Russia today. And perhaps the biggest advantage of all when it comes to naval drones over vast vessels is this: they're uncrewed. That in turn makes them expendable. Ukraine could send 100 drones at a Russian ship, and as long as a few of them hit the target and deal damage, it's a successful mission, without any Ukrainian lives lost or even put at risk in the process. On the Russian side, even the most hardened nationalist military bloggers aren't going to bother celebrating the destruction of a few dozen enemy drones. But if Ukraine can take out a Russian ship and its crew, which can sometimes consist of dozens or even hundreds of Russian soldiers, that's the kind of victory worth boasting about. The drastically cheaper prices of drones compared to warships, frigates, subs, and landing craft makes them even more dispensable. Warships, meanwhile, cost such a lot to make and maintain. They have to be treated with an exceptional amount of care. Operations must be planned out with expert precision, right down to the tiniest detail. And even the tiniest oversight or mistake can lead to catastrophic losses. And even though Russia's warships are vast and imposing, they're certainly not unsinkable. That was proven back in 2022, in the early stages of the war, when the famous missile cruiser, Moskva, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, was sunk by Ukrainian Neptune missiles. This single instance highlighted the startling vulnerability of large warships without sufficient point defense and damage control capabilities. It's not difficult to imagine the Admiral Nakhimov suffering a similar fate if it were to find itself in hostile waters or on the receiving end of a well-orchestrated Ukrainian drone or missile strike. As Sutton writes, big ships like this may be particularly impressive in peacetime, but when it comes to real-world combat scenarios, they're actually not as invulnerable as they seem. Indeed, many aren't any better armored than the smaller ships hiding out in Russia's Black Sea ports. Thus, perhaps Russia may have been better learning the lessons of the Moskva and putting more money into fire suppression and damage control systems for its Nakhimov modernization project, rather than worrying so much about its offensive capacities and the number of missiles on board. Instead, as in so many other cases, when the country has wasted extortionate amounts of money on similar disasters, Russia continues to demonstrate astonishing levels of stubbornness and a remarkable resistance to move with the times. It continues to live in the past, playing by a rulebook the rest of the world has already abandoned. Ultimately, Sutton is one of many analysts to label the Nakhimov much more of a vanity project, focused more on the perception of might than genuinely practical military value. And the costs of this vanity project don't end with the modernization. A ship this size will come with a massive maintenance budget too. The more time goes by and the more Russia has to spend, the more likely it will become that the country's navy eventually decides to cut its losses and decommission the vessel. Meanwhile, Russia's number one enemy, the United States, was already fielding warships with Nakhimov-style land attack capabilities as far back as the 1980s. In fact, some of America's top cruisers, like the Ticonderoga-class vessels, which entered service in 1983, are arguably even more formidable than the Nakhimov today. They can be equipped with up to 122 vertical launch cells, for example, while displacing less than 10,000 tons. In comparison, despite being far larger, the Nakhimov only has around 80 cells. So, not only is the Nakhimov effectively worthless in the war with Ukraine, it's also decades out of date compared to world-leading US hardware. In the end, like Russia's T-14 Armata tank, which has also been hyped up by Putin and his Kremlin cronies, but labeled a pointless vanity project by detractors, the Nakhimov feels far more style than substance. Yet another visually impressive asset that Russia can enjoy showing off at naval parades, but one that fails to deliver any real military value to speak of.
Ukraine watched and waited for an entire year. For 12 months, it was on the hunt for something that Putin and his cronies were so desperate to hide. Patience was the name of Ukraine's game, as it knew that if it got this right, it would take away something that is immensely valuable to Russia in one fell swoop. Then it happened. The perfect opportunity arose for Ukraine to score a historic kill that destroyed what Putin was trying to hide in mere seconds. To find out more, we have to head back in time. From the start of Putin's invasion up until the spring of 2024, the Ivan Kurs prowled the waters of the Black Sea. The ship was one of the most important spy vessels that Russia has in its arsenal, and it's been tasked with providing electronic reconnaissance of Ukraine's movements, in addition to using electronic warfare to tackle drones and provide key communication and fleet command for the rest of the Black Sea Fleet. Ukraine knew that it had to take out this spy ship, even though it represented little attacking threat in its own right. It was playing a key part in organizing Russia's warships and minimizing the strength of Ukraine's attacks. Ukraine couldn't rush in. The Ivan Kurs was slippery, elusive, a ship that Putin was desperate to protect at all costs because he knew that losing it would cripple the attacking power of the Black Sea Fleet, in addition to leaving Crimea open to Ukrainian drone and missile attacks. It would take an entire year for Ukraine to find the perfect time to strike, but when that time came, Ukraine did what it had been waiting to do without hesitation. And as you'll soon discover if you keep watching the video, the true scale of the damage that Ukraine managed to do to the Ivan Kurs is only now coming to light due to the publication of sensational new photos to showcase what a wreck this once proud ship has become. But we'll get to that soon. First, the story of Ukraine's hunt for the ship is key. There were several times before Ukraine managed to score a direct hit against the Ivan Kurs. The country almost took out Russia's ship. May 2023 saw Ukraine come close in an attack that should have set alarm bells ringing for the Kremlin. Ukraine's explosive-filled drone boats managed to get a bead on the Ivan Kurs as it sailed about 75 miles northeast of the Bosporus Strait, deep in the Black Sea. This was an opportunity, though, as Ukraine would soon learn. It wasn't the perfect time to strike. Ukraine's drone boats gave chase, having sailed over 310 miles just to reach the Ivan Kurs in the first place. Still, they had gotten to where they needed to be, and it was only something that was outside of Ukraine's control that stopped the Ivan Kurs from going down far sooner than it eventually did. Ukraine's drone boats tracked and followed the ship, but inclement weather made the Black Sea choppy, and also did a number on the connection that Ukraine's drone boat operators had with their vessels. Ultimately, the drone boat got almost within range of the Russian spy ship before it exploded. Unfortunately, it didn't inflict any damage. The Ivan Kurs had escaped the attack by the skin of its teeth, and Ukraine would have to wait for another day to strike. That day came around 10 months later, on March 26, 2024. HUMILIATING published satellite photographs that appeared to show the badly damaged Ivan Kurs docked in the Crimean port of Sevastopol. Ukraine's Navy spokesperson, Dmytro Pletenchuk, explained what had happened, stating that Ukraine had finally pulled off a series of missile strikes against the ship between March 23rd and 24th, which led to it being taken out of commission. At the time, we didn't know the extent of the damage that Ukraine had managed to do. All we had to go on were Pletenchuk's comments, as he reported, "As for the Ivan Kurs ship, we can confirm the damage to the reconnaissance equipment. That is, in fact, now it's not combat ready. It cannot perform its intended tasks." Not combat ready doesn't necessarily mean the ship had been destroyed, but as we've learned now, the Ivan Kurs has been made absolutely useless to Russia. The few satellite photographs that were published in March 2024 only offered some minor hints at how hard Ukraine had hit Russia's spy ship. But on February 26th, several more photographs came to light and were published by the Crimean Wind Telegram channel. The strike on the Ivan Kurs was carried out on March 24, 2024. Satellite images showed damage to the stern, the channel reported. It added, "The Russians denied damage to the ship, but after the incident, the reconnaissance ship never sailed again. The Russian Black Sea Fleet carefully hid it in its harbors. The ship is currently non-combat ready." That sort of response is typical of Russia. No matter how successful Ukraine is with its attacks, Russia will always claim that nothing happened, or if it did, damage done was minor. However, it's telling that Russia's spy ship has been languishing in the very same Sevastopol port where it was when the initial satellite images of the damaged ship surfaced. Almost 2 years later, the ship hasn't moved an inch, and when you take a closer look at the photographs, it's easy to see why. Ukraine didn't just hit the Ivan Kurs after a full year of hunting. Ukraine crippled one of the Black Sea Fleet's most vital ships. A close examination of the pictures shared by Crimean Wind, which have been taken of the Ivan Kurs at sea level rather than from far above, demonstrates the full extent of the damage that Ukraine caused. The captain's bridge has been almost completely destroyed, which immediately takes away one of the vessel's core command centers. Structural damage has also been done to the Ivan Kurs's mast and funnel. the former of which used to carry the antenna systems that were so vital to the ship's key tasks of gathering intelligence and transmitting information to Russia's other warships. There are other signs that the damage goes even deeper, as United 24 media reports. For one, camouflage netting is seen covering the vessel's forward deck. It's not a stretch to assume that the netting is in place because somewhere underneath it is something that Russia doesn't want anybody to see. More damage seems to be the safest bet, and perhaps damage that is so extensive that Russia hasn't been able to repair it despite trying for almost 2 years. Speaking of repairs, the photographs also show that the ship's mast is surrounded by construction scaffold. That implies that Russia is trying to fix its damaged ship, though it clearly isn't having much success. United 24 media adds that the equipment you would normally expect to see at the stern of the Ivan Kurs appears to be missing. Was it destroyed in Ukraine's missile strike too? Has Russia stripped the ship of that equipment because it knows that there is no hope for the Ivan Kurs to sail in the Black Sea again? We may never know the answers to these questions, but we do know this. Russia was lying when it tried to deny that Ukraine had hit the Ivan Kurs. Everything that we see of the ship now suggests that it hasn't been operational for the best part of 2 years, and given the extent of the damage that is still visible, it doesn't look like Russia is going to get it fixed anytime soon. And what this means for Russia is that the Black Sea Fleet, which has been systematically weakened by Ukraine since Putin launched his invasion, has lost a very important vessel. How important? We'll come back to that question in a moment, but before we do, you are watching The Military Show. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, take a moment to hit the button so you hear all of the latest Ukraine war news. Now, there is a big reason why Ukraine spent so much time hunting down the Ivan Kurs. A year's worth of resources adds up to no small amount of money and time, but it was all worth it because of just how important this ship was to Russia, and especially the Black Sea Fleet. Commissioned to the Black Sea Fleet in 2018, the Ivan Kurs was among Russia's most advanced intelligence collection ships. It was designed to replace Russia's bulkier Soviet-era spy ships, and we see that in its profile. The Ivan Kurs displaces no more than 4,000 tons of water, which is a very purposeful design choice to make the ship seem as unimposing as possible. Russia also made the ship so that it could stay at sea for as long as possible, as it has a range that exceeds 8,000 miles. For context, the Black Sea's largest east-to-west width is 730 miles per the US Naval Institute, which means this one spy ship could sail return journeys across the Black Sea at its widest point, almost 5.5 times before it would need to be refueled. That endurance was key. It meant that when active, the Ivan Kurs acted like ever-present eyes and ears in the single most important stretch of water in the war. KCHF.RU, which is a Russian resource that covers many of the ships in the Black Sea Fleet, explains that Russia was particularly proud of this vessel. The ship on its performance characteristics and capabilities is considerably superior to similar vessels of previous generations, mainly due to the versatility and high level of automation and systems integration, the resource says. On top of that, the Ivan Kurs could present an attacking threat. It was loaded with 6 9K-38 Igla surface-to-air missile launchers, which combined to carry 32 9M39 missiles the ship could use to fire on aircraft and helicopters. Plus, it has 4 14.5mm MTPU-1 Zalo machine guns that it can use to fire on any vessels, including drone boats that get close. This was an impressive ship, at least by Russian naval standards, and now it's ruined. Stuck in the Sevastopol port, where it's been for almost 2 years as a result of a historic Ukrainian drone strike that took a year to plan and appears to have crippled the Ivan Kurs forever. So we know what this single ship meant to Russia. But what does the confirmation of just how much damage that Ukraine's missiles managed to do mean for the Black Sea Fleet and Russia going forward? On the Black Sea Fleet front, this is a major black eye to a collection of ships that were supposed to dominate the naval aspect of the war. Ukraine wasn't even supposed to be able to compete with Russia in this department. It barely has a navy of its own, outside of patrol vessels and a handful of mine warfare ships. For Russia, the Black Sea was supposed to be a route through which it could send soldiers and equipment from Crimea and into mainland Ukraine. Instead, it's become a crypt for the crushed remains of many of the country's warships. Losing ships like the Ivan Kurs has played a huge role in the humiliation of the Black Sea Fleet that we have seen throughout the war. Remember that this was a ship that Russia specifically designed so that it would be able to see attacks coming, and yet it wasn't able to do a thing about the Ukrainian missiles that struck it. And with the ship gone, the Black Sea Fleet is more vulnerable than ever, as is Crimea, by the way, and we'll explain what that has meant for Russia in a moment. Coming back to the Black Sea Fleet, Defense 24 says that the failure of that fleet, which has lost about a third of its ships since Putin launched his invasion, is indicative of Russia not being prepared for the reality of modern naval combat operations. Aerial drones, seaborne drones, and missiles have torn through the Black Sea Fleet, to the point where Russia's warships have had to withdraw so far away from Ukraine just to stay out of range that they're no longer having any sort of noticeable impact on the war. The extent of the damage caused by Ukraine is such that the fleet was even forced to leave its home port of Sevastopol and withdraw to Novorossiysk, all to avoid Ukraine's assaults. Ukraine has even conducted a Storm Shadow missile strike against the fleet's headquarters in Crimea back in 2023, which just goes to show how long and how effective Ukraine's campaign to destroy Russia's naval power has been. And that brings us back to Crimea. By now it's clear that the loss of the Ivan Kurs is just one of many that Russia's Black Sea Fleet has had to endure. That fleet is more vulnerable without the Russian intelligence ship because it isn't getting the data that it needs to properly defend against Ukraine's attacks. The exact same thing can be said about the illegally annexed Crimean Peninsula. It isn't a coincidence that Ukraine has been able to step up its attacks on Crimea now that the Ivan Kurs is stuck in the port that the rest of the Black Sea Fleet has been forced to abandon. Attacks on the bridges that lead into Crimea are a regular occurrence, as are Ukrainian strikes against key assets on the peninsula. In fact, February 20th brought with it news that Ukraine had pulled off a massive drone strike on the Belbek and Kacher airfields in Crimea, along with an attack on a fuel and lubricants depot in Zankoy. And earlier in December, Ukraine pulled off attacks in Crimea that destroyed a pair of Su-27 fighter jets and a MiG-31, along with several air defense units. These aren't isolated attacks. Ukraine's Crimea campaign has been in full swing for well over a year now, because Ukraine has done such a good job of establishing safe aerial corridors over the Black Sea. Would having Ivan Kurs operational have allowed Russia to stop all of these strikes? Probably not, but Russia may have been able to stop some of them. The ship could have been sailing through the Black Sea while serving as an early warning system for Russia's forces on the Crimean Peninsula. Instead, it's stuck in port and clearly in need of some major repairs if it's ever going to sail again. In a campaign that has seen Ukraine slowly and surely degrade Russia's defenses, the destruction of the Ivan Kurs almost 2 years ago may have been the key step that opened up so much of what we're now seeing Ukraine do in Crimea. Given that context, it's clear why Ukraine was willing to spend a year hunting this ship. The benefits on the back end, which include the untold millions, perhaps even billions of dollars in equipment that Russia has lost in Crimea, and the weakening of Russia's assaults against the Ukrainian mainland, make that year hunting extremely worthwhile. You would think that Russia would have been working as hard as it could to get the Ivan Kurs back online, especially with Crimea and the Black Sea Fleet having become so vulnerable, but it hasn't. Way back in January 2025, the Defense Post revealed that Russia had abandoned all of its ship repairs in Crimea due to fears that Ukraine would strike its repair crews as they worked. Pletenchuk was again the bearer of good news for Ukraine as he said, "The main facilities for the Russians are still in Crimea, but we've demonstrated in practice that using repair bases for the Black Sea Fleet is no longer possible," Pletenchuk said of Sevastopol, adding, "To repair their ships, they first need to bring them there, and now no one will be doing that." And though Russia does have some ship repair facilities in Novorossiysk, where the remains of the Black Sea Fleet are based, they're not anywhere near the size and scale needed to serve the entire fleet. The nearest shipyard beyond Novorossiysk is in Zelenodolsk, which is in the Republic of Tatarstan. But that's about 2,200 kilometers or around 1,360 miles away, and any warship that Russia sends there likely won't be able to get back into the Black Sea due to Turkey's banning of warships sailing through the straits that lead into the Black Sea. And even if Russia's ships could reach Zelenodolsk, the facility can only repair small missile ships that are capable of sailing into what was otherwise a landlocked location. Think back to the photographs we discussed earlier in the video. We told you that there was scaffolding around the mast of the Ivan Kurs. That would make it seem like repair work is ongoing. But if Russia hasn't been repairing ships in Sevastopol since at least January 2025, and possibly earlier, then what we're really seeing in that photograph is the remnants of a repair effort that was abandoned, along with the Ivan Kurs, where Russia withdrew from Sevastopol. Russia's destroyed spy ship, which was once the intelligence-gathering crown jewel of the entire Black Sea Fleet, now sits alone in port. With no maintenance, it will rot away slowly and under the watchful gaze of Ukraine. The only reason that the Ivan Kurs hasn't been sent to the bottom of the Black Sea is that Ukraine knows it will be a waste of a missile or drone to do so. The ship is languishing in an empty port. Now the Ivan Kurs is little more than bait that Ukraine can use to draw Russia's repair crews out. Russia could try to fix the ship. It could try to make the Ivan Kurs seaworthy again. But we'd be willing to bet dollars to donuts that any Russian crew that is dumb enough to try to reverse the effects of Ukraine's year-long hunt will be met with missiles and drones that take them out, along with the spy ship they're trying to fix. It's fair to say that Russia's spy ships haven't been having the best time of it over the last few months, and that goes for what they're trying to do outside of Ukraine, along with what the Ivan Kurs was supposed to be doing in the Black Sea. Back in November, a Russian spy ship targeted a Royal Air Force aircraft near the UK, but all that Putin achieved there was to put the UK and NATO on high alert. Russia bled for the territory that it took in the southeast of Ukraine. Months and thousands of soldiers were spent making gains that Putin believed would position his military for a summer offensive in 2026. Putin was wrong. Ukraine turned it all around. Ukrainians have taken back what's theirs, and Putin's southeastern front line has collapsed in just 1 month. This is a victory that will be studied for 100 years, and we're going to explore all of the reasons why Ukraine has chosen now to counterattack. Before we do, here's the headline figure. 400 square kilometers, or about 154 square miles, were regained by Ukraine in about a month. That's according to the Ukrainian military's commander-in-chief Oleksandr Syrskyi, who says that Ukraine has taken this amount of territory, along with 8 of its settlements, back from Russia since January. Syrskyi made these claims on February 23rd, with the implication that more liberations may be coming. All gains were made by Ukraine's airborne units operating alongside adjacent units, which roughly translates to Ukraine using drones to devastate Russia's invading forces, followed by infantry and mechanized units to clear out the stragglers. This is a powerful move by Ukraine. And it's important as much for where it's taken place as it is for the amount of territory that Ukraine has liberated. The Kyiv Independent reports that the bulk of Ukraine's 2026 push against Russia has taken place in the Oleksandrivka direction. To the layman, this small village, which had a population of fewer than 4,000 people in the year that Putin launched his invasion, may seem inconsequential, but it isn't. Oleksandrivka is a unique village because it lies at the intersection of 3 of Ukraine's most important oblasts: Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Dnipropetrovsk. Russia has been attacking all 3 for much of the invasion, and it has big plans for the latter 2 in 2026. At least it did. As Ukraine pushes deeper toward Oleksandrivka, it's liberating vast swathes of territory that Russia intended to use as the launching pads for pushes deeper into Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk this year. What's also interesting about this latest counteroffensive is that it comes on the back of a similar surge by Ukraine in the Donetsk direction back in September. That offensive saw Ukraine focus primarily on the Donetsk Oblast, where it regained 160 square kilometers, or about 61.7 square miles of territory, that it was able to then fortify to turn Putin's push for the city of Pokrovsk into a blood-soaked massacre that cost Russia far more soldiers than it would ever have lost otherwise. That gives you a hint as to one of the reasons why we're seeing Ukraine push toward its southeast, but we'll have more on that in just a few moments. As for the counteroffensive, it doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. According to United 24 media, Syrskyi also reported that operations are ongoing in the Oleksandrivka direction, which suggests that Ukraine's forces are pushing to reclaim even more territory as they take advantage of Russia's loss of access to Starlink. It's possible that the stop won't push until Russia comes up with a suitable replacement, which doesn't seem likely to happen anytime soon. Right now, Russia's best idea has been to use balloons to carry 5G terminals, but those balloons currently only fly for a handful of days at a time. That's no substitute for a massive constellation of satellites, and it means that communication across the front is still veering close to impossible for Russia. When Putin's forces can't talk, Ukraine will take advantage. That's what we're seeing in the southeast, and it's only going to get worse for Russia. Our plan is unchanged: effective fulfillment of the tasks set with maximum preservation of the life and health of our defenders, strengthening defensive capabilities and building capabilities on each section of the front, Syrskyi said in a Telegram post, where he reported the massive gains that Ukraine has made. He added, "We are working systematically and in a coordinated manner to liberate the Ukrainian land." And perhaps that's the big point here. Ukraine hasn't rushed into an offensive that is costing it untold numbers of soldiers so that it can regain some land. Everything that we're seeing in the southeast of the country right now is carefully calculated to ensure that Ukraine retakes the maximum amount of territory possible with as minimal a cost to its military as it can manage. That's the complete opposite of Russia's approach. Putin has no other strategy than to throw cannon fodder into the meat grinder of Ukraine's defenses, which is why Russia has lost 65,000 soldiers to death or injury in 2026 alone, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte said at the Munich Security Conference in mid-February. If Russia keeps that up, it will have lost around 390,000 soldiers by the end of the year, and that is an optimistic figure. When we told you that Russia has bled for the territory that Ukraine had liberated over the past month, this is what we meant. Now that Russia's southeastern lines are collapsing under a Ukrainian advance, this is what 400 square kilometers gained in a month really means. On February 17th, Newsweek highlighted the fact that the pace of Ukraine's recent gains was such that the country has retaken more territory from Russia since it launched its southeastern counteroffensive than it has gained in the last 2.5 years. And that claim was made when Ukraine's gains stood at 201 square kilometers or 77.6 square miles. Fast forward just a week, and the gains are now double that amount, taking what was already an impressive counterattack into truly historic territory. Along the way, Ukraine has retaken some key settlements that Russia intended to use as launching points for future assaults. RBC Ukraine highlights some of them, noting that Ukraine has liberated Nechaivka, Pishana, Andriivka, Radizna, Ostapivska, and Nova Zaporizhia, all of which are in the direction of the Alexandriivka sector we mentioned earlier. When Syrskyi said that Ukraine's approach was systematic, he was referring to how Ukraine has expertly cleared Russia's soldiers out of these settlements so that they can all be used to mount a stronger offensive right now, and later a defense against Russia's forces. These settlements aren't part of some sort of grey zone where fighting between Ukraine and Russia is ongoing either. RBC Ukraine adds that Russia's forces haven't been seen anywhere near the settlements that Ukraine has cleared at any point during the 2 weeks leading up to February 24th. Through this counteroffensive, combined with what may still be to come, Ukraine has also achieved goals relating to maintaining its supply chains, which in turn allows it to keep up its momentum by ensuring ammunition deliveries don't get interrupted and evacuating wounded from the battlefield. What it all amounts to is that Russia's gains have been reversed in about a month, and Ukraine is now in a position to set itself up for what it believes is coming in the future. And that brings us back to why Ukraine has chosen now to launch its counteroffensive in the southeast. But before we go deeper into that, this is why we make the military show, to explain how power really moves on the battlefield. If you want more of this kind of insight, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. So we could tell you that Ukraine has launched its counteroffensive as a way of thumbing its collective nose at Russia, the forcing of a humiliation that Putin wasn't prepared for, in a sense. However, though humiliation of Russia's insane president is always a positive for Ukraine, there are several other reasons why Ukraine is now pushing in the southeast, starting with something that Putin himself has been trying to do. Putin has spent the last few months attempting to establish a specific narrative. With peace talks ongoing, the most recent of which in Geneva have led to little progress, Putin is trying to position Russia as an all-conquering force and Ukraine as a tiny country that is collapsing under Russia's might. Anybody who has paid attention to the last 4 years of fighting knows that this narrative is nonsense. But every so often, Ukraine needs to reinforce that point whenever it looks like Putin is successfully manipulating his way into convincing the US, which has positioned itself as the main mediator in peace talks, that Russia is on the verge of victory. The narrative needs to be shattered, and Ukraine's massive counterattack goes a long way toward doing that. According to the Wall Street Journal, the mere fact that the Ukraine war has officially entered its 5th year shows that the Russian victory that Putin claims to be inevitable is anything but. Ukraine has embarrassed Russian generals' claims of significant gains by largely clearing the city of Kupiansk in the northeast of Russian forces and retaking several villages in the southeastern Zaporizhia region, the outlet says. And that's the entire point. As Putin tries to drip his off-brand fake honey into the collective US ear, Ukraine is delivering straight from the hive. Every square mile that Ukraine liberates is a signal to the US that Ukraine is a long way from being out of the fight. No military that is on the verge of collapse that Putin claims is coming could be doing what Ukraine is doing right now. And as Seth Jones, who is the president of the Defense and Security Department at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, tells the Journal, all that Putin has left is his attempts to convince the US that Russia is winning. That's the big breakthrough in a war that his military is unable to win, Jones says of what Putin is trying to do with his narrative, adding, the real hope is that the US will come to their aid. But narrative collapse is just the start. One of the things that Ukraine is doing is setting up to absolutely annihilate more of Putin's forces in 2026. But before we get to how, there is another reason for the southeast counteroffensive to cover. One of the things that Ukraine is doing with this push is forcing Putin and his military cronies into making difficult decisions about what to do with the reserve forces that Russia has stationed in the occupied territories of Ukraine. Captain Dmytro Filatov, who is the commander of Ukraine's 1st Separate Assault Regiment, highlights this by pointing out how Ukraine is now forcing Russia into playing a game that Putin doesn't want to play. We're not focused on the deepest possible penetration, Filatov says of Ukraine's recent gains, indicating that the headline figures aren't as important as what the gains allow Ukraine to do. Rather, Ukraine's goal, or one of them, is to force the enemy to deploy its reserves not where it plans, but where we plan. It's all about taking the initiative, which feeds into the point that we've already made about Putin's narrative and the point we're about to make about how Ukraine intends to use the territory that it's gained. This is Ukraine taking control over the battlefield by forcing Russia to dedicate soldiers to territories that it thought it had already secured. Of course, the inevitable happens due to this. More of Russia's soldiers die after being deployed for operations that are far different than those that they were preparing for. This creates the combined effect of draining Russian reserves at a time when Putin doesn't need that happening, and weakening Russian offensives and defenses elsewhere, which creates yet more opportunities for Ukraine. Putin was told that something like this was coming. Back in January, Syrskyi himself announced that Ukraine was planning new offensive operations in 2026. UA Wire reported the Ukrainian military's commander-in-chief as stating, "Therefore, we will conduct a strategic defensive operation. At the same time, we understand you cannot win by defense alone. Accordingly, we will carry out offensive operations and fight to maintain operational initiative, because that forces the enemy to commit and withdraw significant manpower, weapons, and ammunition to contain our active actions." Syrskyi spelled out what was happening for Putin before the push even started, and still, Russia couldn't do a thing about it. The systemic approach that Ukraine has taken to making its most recent gains was clearly planned well ahead of time, to the point that Ukraine was confident enough to reveal its hand because it knew it had already won the pot. Everything that Syrskyi said was going to happen has come true, and it looks like Ukraine forcing Russia to burn more of its reserves is working. As Euronews reported on February 20th, Russia is now looking into using a form of rolling and involuntary military call-ups, which essentially amounts to a stealth mobilization to force more of its reserves into Ukraine. The volunteers are drying up, and Russia is being forced to push people who don't want to fight in Ukraine so that they can plug gaps that Ukraine is creating. This is brilliant by Ukraine. It now has control over the situation in the southeast. And Ukraine gaining that control brings us back to something that we've hinted at throughout the video. Right now, Ukraine is going on the offensive, which is having the knock-on effect of causing chaos in Putin's plans for Russia's reserves. However, Ukraine's offensive is actually being made with defense in mind. Why? Ukraine knows what Russia has planned for the summer. Back in early February, the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, reported that Russian military command has been gearing up for a large-scale offensive in the summer that will focus on Ukraine's southern and eastern territories. In other words, the precise regions where Ukraine is making gains as we speak. That offensive was already in doubt before the news broke of Ukraine's gains, as the ISW noted that the Russian military likely lacks the reserves that it needs to achieve the offensive's aims, which appear to be a combination of a push toward the Donetsk cities of Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, along with a push toward the direction of Zaporizhia City and Orikhiv. Russia was already struggling to seize the territory it needed to launch those offensives. Now it's lost more. Ukraine isn't going to be sitting on its collective hands now that it's liberated 400 square kilometers of territory in the direction that Russia intends to push. Far from it. Building up additional defenses will soon be on Ukraine's agenda, with the fortification likely ongoing and due to start in earnest after Ukraine completes its current push. Andriy Kramarov, who is a reserve officer of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, essentially said as much to UNN when discussing Ukraine's historic counteroffensive. Kramarov notes that Ukraine had been somewhat lax in its approach to Zaporizhia in particular, even as Russia amassed about 150,000 reserves in that direction. It turned out that we also did not have a sufficiently built defense there. The Russians brought in reserves and were able to occupy certain positions, the officer tells UNN. Ukraine's push has snatched back some of those positions, and it's a move that tells Putin that Ukraine won't make the same mistake twice. If Russia does indeed intend to conduct a summer push into Ukraine's southeast, it's going to have to make that push through massive kill zones that Ukraine can now create due to its liberation of so much territory. Russia never expected the kind of resistance that it's about to face. And Ukraine's new defenses will churn through the soldiers that are committed to the southeast in the summer. To understand why, let's take a glimpse into what have become known as the kill zones of the Ukraine war, often stretching for as far as 20 kilometers or a little over 12 miles beyond the front lines. Kill zones are the areas that Ukraine has layered with so many defenses that it's become inevitable that Russia has to spill the blood of thousands of its soldiers for every small advance made through them. Ukraine uses terrain to its advantage in these kill zones, as United 24 media explains. Barbed wire is layered all over the ground. Some of that wire is placed in massive spools stretching across the front, which bogs Russia's soldiers down and forces them to try to slowly cut through. Networks of thinner barbed wire are also placed on the ground, ready to slice through legs of unsuspecting soldiers, again causing delays. If Russia tries to send mechanized units through the kill zones, they're met with dragon's teeth and anti-tank ditches, again designed to slow them down. Anti-tank mines are everywhere, waiting to blow the tracks off a tank and destroy armored vehicles as they progress. Then there are the drones. Thousands of them. Operated both from behind the kill zones and from tunnels that Ukraine has built into them, some of these drones watch and others destroy. Reconnaissance drones scan miles of kill zones looking for Russian assault forces. When they're found, often caught up in barbed wire and anti-tank defenses, the strike drones are deployed. FPV drones rain down on Russian forces, causing death at a scale that is simply unsustainable for Russia. And to add an extra layer of genius to the whole approach, Ukraine uses its layered defenses to force the Russians to take narrow and obvious routes toward their targets. You can guess what happens when Ukraine manages to funnel Putin's soldiers into the choke points that it's created. Drones, missiles, and artillery all strike, causing yet more damage. The creation of more of these kill zones in the southeast is ultimately what Ukraine's massive counteroffensive is about. Ukraine knows that a Russian offensive is coming, and it's going to ensure that Russia bleeds for every inch of territory that it takes. This is an offense to support a form of defense that is offensive in its own right. And again, Ukraine is open about what it's doing because it knows that Russia can't do a thing about it. Ukraine's defense minister Mikhailo Fedorov laid it all out during a meeting with journalists on January 20th, where he said that Ukraine's strategy for 2026 is simple. Make the cost of the war for Russia one it cannot sustain, thereby forcing peace through strength. Fedorov noted that one of Ukraine's strategic objectives this year is to reach 50,000 confirmed kills against Russia's military every single month. The kill zones that we're going to start seeing popping up all over the territory that Ukraine just liberated are going to play a huge role in achieving that objective. If Russia is going to treat its soldiers like resources, Ukraine is going to make Putin spend as much as possible. Russia has been officially outmaneuvered. Now it faces a summer of pain that could be worse for Putin's forces than anything that we've seen in the war so far. Russia never accounted for any of this. Its soldiers are already being boxed in and wiped out in other regions of Ukraine, and they'll soon face the same fate in the southeast. Staggering losses in manpower, armor, and money have already been caused by Ukraine's kill zone strategy.
It seemed like a crazy decision. When Ukraine's forces fell back north of Pokrovsk, many thought they were giving up the key Donetsk city. They weren't. Ukraine's forces made a strategic sacrifice to break Russia's southern army. Pokrovsk was placed on the altar of war so that Ukraine could prepare for something much bigger elsewhere, and the gamble has paid off. Total victory over Russia in Zaporizhia has arrived. Now, at first glance, what's happening in the Donetsk region of Ukraine seems like a nightmare scenario. Pokrovsk and the surrounding settlements are officially lost. That's according to the AMK Mapping X account, which says that Russia's reclamation of Rodinska has placed the entire Pokrovsk agglomeration under Russia's control. That settlement, along with Pokrovsk, Mirnorad, Novohrodivka and Hrodivka, are now in Russian hands after a battle that lasted over 1.5 years. The fall of Pokrovsk came in the wake of Russia's scaling up of offensives to the north of the city in an effort to surround it, the Kyiv Independent reported on February the 16th. That scaling up left Ukraine's 7th Corps as one of the very few units still holding positions in the Pokrovsk agglomeration, and the Russian forces were closing in fast. The order to withdraw came soon after this report, leading to Pokrovsk's capture, a shocking half a year after Putin made that capture the key goal of Russia's 2025 summer offensive. This is a city that was meant to fall when the sun still shone, allowing Russia to consolidate its position ahead of a deeper push into Donetsk during the winter. That push never happened because Pokrovsk held on for far longer than it had any right to. This should be a time for Putin's forces to celebrate, but it isn't. Looks can be deceiving, and the pincer movement that Russia was trying to create around Pokrovsk just a couple of days ago was something that Ukraine expected. And when Ukraine withdrew from the Pokrovsk sector, it did so knowing that it was doing something very important, making a small sacrifice in Donetsk so it could make massive gains elsewhere. And here's the twist to the Pokrovsk tale. As David Axe explains in a February 18th column for Euromaidan Press, the gains the Russians have made in recent days in and around the neighbouring cities of Pokrovsk and Mirnorad, 100 kilometers northeast of Huliapola, merely consolidate Russian control over those cities and don't really help the Russians advance toward their ultimate objectives in Donetsk Oblast, the twin cities of Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, 50 kilometers to the northeast, Axe explains. In other words, all that Russia has managed to achieve in Pokrovsk is taking a city that Ukraine was only holding so long to inflict as much damage on Russia's forces in Donetsk. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers died taking a city that they were already most of the way to holding. And now, as you'll discover if you keep watching the video, they have an even bigger challenge ahead of them as they try to push deeper into Donetsk. What we've seen here is Ukraine purposefully sacrificing the Pokrovsk sector. It seems like a strange choice. With Pokrovsk having long been considered one of the most important logistical nodes in Donetsk, it may even seem like an insane decision to allow the city to fall. However, Ukraine had a master plan when it pulled its forces out of Pokrovsk. Let Russia have its Pyrrhic victory because Ukraine had much bigger fish to fry elsewhere. Ukraine sacrificed Pokrovsk so it could ruin Russia's southern army in Zaporizhia. The reality for Russia is that its gains in Pokrovsk are gains that it should have made months ago. They've moved practically nowhere, and Pokrovsk is no longer seen as the logistical node that would help Ukraine push back in Donetsk. The city was turned into a death trap, and Putin's forces paid a massive price in blood to get it. And as that price was being paid, Ukraine turns its attention to something much more valuable in the southeast of the country. An enormous Ukrainian counterattack was launched in the southeast as Russia took control over the Pokrovsk region, leading to Ukraine making massive gains that delivered something much more valuable than the city that it had just lost. How? Well, as Axe explains, Ukraine's focus on Pokrovsk toward the end of 2025 turned its attention away from the Zaporizhia region. The path for Russia into that region was left relatively open, Axe says, as it was devoid of any major fortifications. However, every path that Russia can take toward Kramatorsk and Sloviansk is extremely well fortified. Ukraine knows that those paths are going to churn through tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Russian troops. But the pathway to Zaporizhia being so open would have allowed Russia to advance quickly in that region as soon as Putin placed his focus on it. So, Ukraine pulled the Pokrovsk plug to make gains in Zaporizhia, with those gains being part of a larger campaign to fortify heavily ahead of a future Russian assault. And that's one of the reasons why Ukraine made its sacrifice, along with several others that we'll be digging into soon. But before we do, Axe explains what we have seen on the Zaporizhia front in recent weeks. Ukraine's heaviest counterattacks came in the southeast direction, across a 35-kilometer or 21.7-mile sector that stretched from Pokrovska, which is a settlement in Dnipropetrovsk that is easy to confuse with Petrovsk in Donetsk, and the city of Huliopole in the south. That region was under attack by Russia's Dnipro group of forces, who Axe says held a 5-to-1 manpower advantage. Rather than trying to take advantage of that extra manpower with massive assaults, Russia has been sending infiltration units into the southeastern sector to inch closer toward claiming Zaporizhia city. Ukraine sacrificed Pokrovsk so that it could respond to this push. A massive Ukrainian counterattack, which saw Ukraine rush its forces south toward the Huliopole sector, began in early February. Airborne and assault brigades combined forces to attack from the west and north of the Russian positions in the sector, placing pressure on Russia's 36th Combined Arms Army in Pokrovska. Russia's southern army was caught entirely by surprise, and the collapse of Russian positions quickly followed. Ukraine deployed its 425th Assault Regiment, which has been fighting actively north of Pokrovsk until February, to take part in the counterattack. This is just one example of Ukraine's sacrifice. Ukraine knew that moving this regiment would enable Russia to advance in Pokrovsk. The trade-off was that the regiment played a starring role in the assaults to the southeast that have allowed Ukraine to liberate massive amounts of territory that Russia thought it could hold. And when we say massive amounts, we mean it. But before we go deeper into that, this is why we make the military show, to explain what battlefield changes really mean. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Now, Ukraine's Pokrovsk gamble has paid off massively, with a helping hand from a major blow to the gut that Russia experienced, which we'll expose in just a couple of minutes. According to France 24, Ukraine's southeast counterattack led to it making the fastest battlefield gains that it had enjoyed in 2.5 years. Those with long memories will realize that the last time Ukraine made such extensive gains was during the country's massive summer 2023 counteroffensive. And up until February 16th, Ukraine had retaken 201 square kilometers, or 78 square miles, of occupied territory in the southeast, which roughly amounts to all of the territory that Russia has managed to gain during its December push towards Zaporizhia. Much of the recaptured territory is concentrated in a sector about 80 kilometers, or almost 50 miles, to the east of Zaporizhia city, which is the entire point. What were once grey zones into which Russia was infiltrating is now fully territory that is fully under Ukraine's control. And with that control, Ukraine is going to close a gap that has existed for far too long, which will be hell for Russia as it tries to push deeper into Zaporizhia. And Ukraine hasn't finished yet. On February the 18th, UA Wire reported that Ukrainian forces had pushed Russia's troops back another 4.5 kilometers, or 2.8 miles, in 3 sectors near Huliopole. That push added to advances that Ukraine has already made across a 20-kilometer, or 12.4-mile stretch of the front line in the Oleksandrivka-Huliopole axis, the outlet says. With this latest push, Ukraine has made advances near the settlements of Tarnova, Verbova, and Vishneva. The spokesperson for Ukraine's defense forces of the south, Vladislav Voloshin, has also reported that reconnaissance operations are underway to enable Ukraine's assault forces to find and eliminate more Russian infiltrators, thus solidifying Ukraine's control over the territory it has liberated. And all of this was made possible by Ukraine's Pokrovsk sacrifice. Ukraine gave a little to gain a lot. But remember, we told you that Ukraine had something of a helping hand in all of this, and that helping hand came from Elon Musk and SpaceX. Now, in early February, SpaceX made the long-awaited decision to cut off Russia's access to Starlink by blacklisting the illicit terminals that Russia had been using for long-range drone strikes and communication on the front. That single decision caused chaos in Russia's military, BBC News Russian reported on February the 10th. Having access to Starlink has allowed forces on both sides to quickly exchange information, thus enabling them to coordinate their operations. Now, Russia doesn't have Starlink. Ukraine still does. Its terminals have been added to a whitelist to ensure that they still work, while Russia flounders without access to one of the key things that were keeping its troops alive on the battlefield. Russia has been trying to create backup communications to overcome this massive loss, but none is as effective as Starlink. So what we've seen in Ukraine's southeast is Ukrainian forces timing their push with the Russian loss of Starlink. And when taken into that context, the sacrifice of Pokrovsk makes even more sense. Ukraine bluffed Russia into thinking that it was making a massive battlefield gain so that it could swoop in through Zaporizhia to snatch back territory from Russian infiltrators who had been left alone and vulnerable due to their Starlink terminals being severed. And to make matters even worse for Russia, Starlink isn't coming back. Putin's forces may now hold Pokrovsk, but for the push into Donetsk that comes off the back of that, they'll be without the convenient communication system that has allowed them to coordinate their offensive so well up to this point. And so well might be an overstatement. Russia has lost over 1.25 million of its soldiers so far in the war, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. Now that those forces have lost access to Starlink, the future for Russia seems to be a whole lot more death and even slower gains on the battlefield. Now that you know about the vital sacrifice that Ukraine has made and the effect that it has had on Russia's southern army, we need to answer the key question that we've touched on several times already. Why? Well, peace talks have something to do with it, so stick with us to find out why. But the first and most important reason that Ukraine made the Pokrovsk sacrifice is that it needed to close the gap on Zaporizhia. We've already told you that Russia had a fairly open path to Zaporizhia city, but you also need to know why that matters. So Zaporizhia is one of the key energy hubs in Ukraine. In addition to being home to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, which is already under Russia's control, the region contains the Dnieper hydroelectric station and the Botievo wind farm, with these 3 facilities combining to provide 25% of all of Ukraine's electricity. Allowing Russia to run roughshod over Zaporizhia would essentially mean giving Putin free rein to do whatever he wants with a quarter of the country's entire supply. Novaya Gazeta adds that Russia has been piling the pressure on Zaporizhia through the battlefield gains it had made during the winter, much of which Ukraine has reversed with its brilliant counteroffensive. Zaporizhia city itself had been edging closer to being in range of Russia's artillery, which would have allowed Putin's forces to brutalize the city as they have so many others in Ukraine. Voloshin adds that Russia had been transferring airborne units from places like Kherson and Dnipro to regions around Zaporizhia, likely in preparation for a concerted assault on the city at some point in the spring. Zaporizhia needs to be protected for these reasons. And with Ukraine having a good idea of what's coming later in 2026, the sacrifice of Pokrovsk to counter in the southeast is a brilliant position. Now that Ukraine controls so much territory that Russia took just a couple of months ago, it's able to fortify ahead of the renewed Russian path. Ukraine will create defenses like those that we saw in Pokrovsk, which means that Russia will have to sacrifice soldiers and equipment just to regain what it has just lost in advance of any sort of push towards Zaporizhia city itself. What we're essentially seeing is Ukraine setting up to implement its attrition-based defense against Russia once again. And even if Russia is able to break through those defenses, a great loss to itself, Zaporizhia city isn't going to be an easy capture. As the Armed Forces of Ukraine Colonel Roman Zvitan explains to Novaya Gazeta, the Russian offensive hasn't let up for a minute since the autumn of 2023, but there's no question of them capturing Zaporizhzhia yet. It's a very large city, which had a population of over 700,000 people before the invasion in February 2022. There may still be up to 500,000 people living there. Svitan believes that 2026 won't be the year that Russia takes Zaporizhzhia city, and that's the entire point of what Ukraine is doing. The more time that it can buy through counteroffensives, the better the defenses it can create, and the more damage that it can do to Russia's attacking forces in the future. Still, the question has to be asked, what about Donetsk? Well, there are two angles to take with the sacrifice of Pokrovsk beyond what we've seen in Ukraine's southeast. The first of those angles is that Pokrovsk had already served its purpose for Ukraine. The city was a logistical hub, sure, though its importance in that area had diminished substantially by 2025. Since Russia launched its summer offensive in 2025, Pokrovsk and the regions around it have been used more as a kill zone by Ukraine, again with the intention of tearing through Russia's Donetsk forces so they're too exhausted to do what Putin needs them to do next. And Pokrovsk has been very effective as an attritional force that ripped through Russia. As recently as February, the head of communications for the 7th Rapid Response Corps of Ukraine's air assault forces, Colonel Volodymyr Polevy, was telling the New Voice of Ukraine that Russia was losing about 6,000 soldiers per month trying to take Pokrovsk. The number was likely higher when taking into account all of the settlements around Pokrovsk that Russia's forces were trying to take. Before that, David Axe wrote in his Trenchard column that Russia has suffered 10,000 casualties trying to take Pokrovsk between January and the beginning of October 2025. The New Voice of Ukraine adds that Russia lost 15,000 soldiers in 6 months, up to February, trying to capture Pokrovsk, all solely within the sector of the 7th Rapid Response Corps Zone of Defense. Again, there would have been more losses elsewhere. The point here is that Pokrovsk has destroyed much of the force that Putin dedicated to taking the city, and it has left the remains of that force utterly shattered for what Putin needs it to do next. Take Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Now, I mentioned those two cities earlier in the video, and they're set to give Russia a much harder time than Pokrovsk ever did. The reason is that they, along with several others, are part of the Donetsk fortress belt that Ukraine has spent the last couple of years building up. And when we said that Pokrovsk had served its purpose, we also meant that Ukraine holding the city for as long as it did had given it time to amass defenses elsewhere in Donetsk. Medusa calls that fortress belt the deal breaker because Putin is demanding that Ukraine hand it over without a fight. Now, this isn't the showcase of strength that Putin wants it to appear to be. Russia's president knows that his military faces a literal hell on earth as it tries to push from Pokrovsk into the Donetsk fortress belt. And the scale of death seen in Pokrovsk will look like nothing in comparison to what this belt of cities delivers to Russia. A peek inside the fortress belt fortifications provided by United 24 media demonstrates why. It says that the Donetsk region has been turned into a defense network of fortifications that stretches for miles, all of which are layered and many of which are placed on higher ground that gives Ukraine's artillery operators and drone pilots clear views of the Russian forces that will attempt to infiltrate. Barbed wire, mines, anti-tank defenses, and countless drones now occupy the kill zones that Russia will have to navigate to even get close to the fortress belt itself. And after going through that meat grinder, Russia still has to capture the cities that make up the belt itself, several of which are larger than Pokrovsk. It's a task that the Institute for the Study of War says could take Russia up until 2028 to complete. And that adds up to at least 2 more years of constant death in Putin's army. Pokrovsk was a precursor for all of this, and Ukraine's sacrifice of it is essentially an invitation to Putin's forces to try their luck in a vast kill zone that makes Pokrovsk look like a picnic. And as Zaporizhzhia, Ukraine is now in a position to create similar layered defenses that have the potential to make 2026 the most catastrophic year for the Russian army that we've seen since Putin launched his invasion. Finally, there are the peace talks we mentioned a few minutes ago. Ukraine's sacrifice of Pokrovsk was clever because all it meant was that Russia gained something that it already claimed to have, and that's not exactly leverage for Putin. He's not going to go into peace talks and admit that he lied when he said that Pokrovsk fell in December. And as for Ukraine, it now has almost 80 square miles of liberated territory in the southeast to crow about, and that is leverage. As Russia pushes for Ukraine to cede territory, Ukraine can counter by saying that Russia can't even hold onto the territory that it has. Bear in mind that Ukraine's most recent gains occurred as envoys from Russia and Ukraine were set to meet to discuss peace terms. Why should Ukraine cede? Death awaits its forces elsewhere in Donetsk, and the same will soon be true of Zaporizhia now that Ukraine's counterattack has bought it time and territory to set up fortifications. Russia's southern army is going to be broken by what Ukraine has just done, and its Donetsk forces will be exhausted. With its brilliant gamble, Ukraine may just have set itself on the path for total victory against Russia in 2026. And as all of this has been happening, Ukraine has been transforming its drones into ever more efficient death-dealing machines. Ukraine has a 24/7 McDonald's operation in place with its drones, and they're ruining Russia's forces already.
Ukraine has been building up for this. For months, it's whittled away at the Russian war machine, weakening Putin's forces over time. Now, Ukraine struck. Ripping through the Russian front line in one brutal push, Ukraine has carved a 9.5-kilometer scar into Russia's defenses. This is humiliating for Russia, embarrassing. And as the Russian front rips wide open, Ukraine takes back what's theirs to force Russia into retreat. Following Russia's recent loss of the illicit Starlink terminals that it used for everything from basic battlefield communication to its long and mid-range drone assaults, Ukraine has taken advantage, launching assaults across 3 sectors of the approximate 1,100-kilometer or 684-mile front line. Ukraine has sent Russian infiltration forces packing and reclaimed territory that Russia took months to capture. The numbers make for embarrassing reading for Putin. As for February 16th, Ukraine has liberated over a dozen settlements in about a week and appears to be pushing toward a major Russian defensive hub as its soldiers go on the hunt. We'll come back to that hub soon. Ukraine's biggest gains took place in the Zaporizhia region, where its combined assault infantry, drone units and armored transport teams managed to retake 5 villages across a 30-kilometer or 19-mile combat line near the city of HUMILIATED. Russia's forces in that area have been forced to go on the run. Those forces have retreated all the way back across the HUMILIATED River that it had taken them months to cross, undoing gains made back in the summer in the process. This is huge for Ukraine, and Euromaidan Press has even more details. It points out that Russia had spent about 2 months on offensives in the direction of Alexandrivka and HUMILIATED, capturing the latter to enable pushes west and northwest. However, something went wrong for Russia. Around February 8th, which is uncoincidentally around the time that Russia lost access to Starlink, the pushes in these directions nearly stopped. Ukraine saw an opportunity and struck hard. In the Alexandrivka sector, Ukraine struck to the southeast, forcing Russia's forces out of the settlements of Orestopil and Oleksivka, which set the stage for advances toward Terova and Berezova, Euromaidan Press reports. Another river also came into play here, this time the Yanchor River. Ukraine's forces pushed along that river, retaking the settlements of Yehorivka, Slahoda, Ribna, Vishneva, and Pershor-Trevneva. Right now, Euromaidan Press adds, Ukraine seems to be pushing to liberate the settlement of Pravilna in what seems to be a clear attempt to push Russia's forces back across yet another river. Another of Ukraine's pushes took place north of HUMILIATED in the direction of the Haichur River we mentioned. Ukraine's forces actually managed to cross that river in the process of pushing Russia back. They retook Kozhevtseva and Ternivata as they did. A parallel push, focused on the same river, also saw Ukraine reclaim the settlements of Preluki and Olenokostiantinivka, leading to a push toward Varvarivka, which is already under partial Ukrainian control. And there's more. Ukraine also launched a brutal push into the zone occupied by Russia's 58th Combined Arms Army, Euromaidan Press reports. It's unknown whether Ukraine managed to make any significant settlement gains in this push, though it did manage to force back Russian units in the Stepnohirsk, Lukyanivska, and Primorska regions, as well as outright stopping Russia's assaults flat along the Stepova-Pavlivka axis. And if Russian offensives have stopped, that may well mean there'll be more opportunities for Ukrainian counterattacks. After all, we said earlier that Russian units stopping its assaults created an opening for everything that we've seen over the past week. More openings are forming. More of the territory that Russia occupies is under threat. We said that this is an embarrassment for Russia earlier in the video. That was an understatement. This is a doomsday scenario for Russia's forces. Commanders who had proudly crowed to their superiors that territory had been taken now have to go back and try to explain how all of that territory was lost. Soldiers who were sacrificed to the meat grinder of the war have been proven as worthless as Putin treats them. Ukraine has done in a week what it took Russia more than 2 months to do. And we're going to touch on how Ukraine managed to pull all of this off in just a couple of minutes. First, we have some more numbers. And these numbers catapult an already dire situation for Russia into catastrophe territory. You may have already guessed that liberating so many villages would mean that Ukraine's advance over the week leading up to February 16th was massive. Euromaidan Press offers one figure, noting that Ukraine had managed to claw back 9.5 kilometers, or about 5.9 miles of territory from Russia, across the area of the front where it launched its counterattacks. That's impressive enough in its own right. It gets even better than that. As France24 explains, the pushback amounts to something even bigger than that. In less than a week, Ukraine retook 201 square kilometers, or a little over 77.6 square miles from Russia, which amounts to the biggest gains that Ukraine has made for around 2.5 years of the war. The last time that Ukraine took back so much territory was during its ultimately failed summer 2023 counteroffensive. However, that counteroffensive was launched with the express purpose of retaking as much as possible. This one is different. Yes, Ukraine has retaken a lot of territory in a very short period of time, but there is a very specific purpose behind these liberations, which we'll explain in detail if you stick with us until the end of the video. Before that, let's come back to how Ukraine managed to pull this off. There are two major factors in play, one of which we've touched on a couple of times already: Starlink. The Starlink shutdown played a massive role in what Ukraine pulled off, as explained by Preston Stewart during his in-depth analysis of the Ukrainian breakthrough. He points out that other analysts have noted that Russia's loss of Starlink has prevented its drones from flying. That's only partially accurate, and it may not have had any bearing on what Ukraine just pulled off. Yes, some of Russia's drones used Starlink. However, as Stewart notes, most of the drones that did use Starlink were long and medium-range drones that Russia was using to attack Ukraine in the rear. Russia's FPV drone operators would likely still have been operating in the regions of Zaporizhia that Ukraine just reclaimed, though you could argue that losing mid-range drones meant that Russia couldn't do anything to weaken the Ukrainian assault that was coming. Far more important on the Starlink front was the loss of communications it inflicted on Russia's soldiers. Starlink has disrupted communications and has impacted the use of some drones, Stewart says. Think about what that means for Russia. Its approach for much of 2025 and into 2026 had been to send small units of infiltrators to set up weak defenses inside Ukrainian territory. Those infiltrators completely rely on communication from command to know where they're going, what they need to be doing, and when, or if, reinforcements are arriving to help them transform the tiny footholds they form into actual combat lines. With Starlink snatched away from Russia, all of that communication disappears, and what Russia is left with are small pockets of soldiers that are running around blind. They don't know where they're going or what they're supposed to be doing next. So all they can do is hunker down in their shoddy defenses and hope that Ukraine's assault units don't find them. That didn't work out so well for the infiltrators. After all, the second reason why Ukraine was able to pull off its remarkable counteroffensive is that it has adopted a new strategy to help deal with the Russian infiltration strategy. Stewart explains, pointing out that Ukraine has developed a new tactic where it forms small units of its own that head out on seek and destroy missions to utterly ruin the infiltrators in their territory. These groups may have platoon sizes of around 12 to 20 soldiers, Stewart claims, and their jobs are to push through the grey zones that Russia claims to occupy, eliminating any traces of the infiltrators as they go. They have very, very, very detailed intelligence of the area they move into, and they have a set objective: move through this series of buildings, clear to here and then stop, and then pause and regroup, Stewart says when explaining Ukraine's approach. It's a methodical method, and it's proving extremely effective at dealing with the infiltration groups that Russia is attempting to use to lay weak claims on territory that it was barely holding even before Ukraine launched its devastating series of counterattacks. Russia has overextended itself across the front. Ukraine has combined flexibility with units that are stronger than those Russia sneaks in to demolish Putin's forces and retake territory. Or as one Ukrainian soldier told Army Inform, "We hunt the flag stickers and destroy them." That soldier is Colonel Vladislav Voloshin, who is the spokesperson for Ukraine's defense forces of the south, which are operating in the Hulia and Alexandrivka directions, where we've seen Ukraine retake so much territory in the past week. When we detect these groups that have infiltrated, we clear the settlements of them, Voloshin explains, adding, "I emphasize that these settlements were and remain under our control. The Russians did not control them. We are simply searching for these infiltrated flag stickers and destroying them." In other words, Ukraine is taking back what's theirs. And it's taking the territory back from Russian forces that barely held it in the first place. In a moment, we're going to explain what Ukraine is really trying to achieve with this series of counteroffensives. Before we go deeper into that, this is The Military Show, and we bring you the full picture, not just the headlines. Subscribe today to stay ahead of the curve with daily updates. In response to everything that Ukraine has achieved over the past week, Russia's response has been weak. The Defense Ministry is keeping its lips firmly sealed, meaning it's left to the Russian military bloggers to try to explain away Russia's massive losses. Most are reporting something resembling the reality of the situation, Stewart says. There is one, a man named Yuri Podolyaka, who is desperately trying to minimize Ukraine's achievements by characterizing them as an attempt to do something that Ukraine absolutely isn't trying to do. Stewart quotes Podolyaka as trying to claim that the Ukrainian push hasn't been all that effective, and while ignoring the territory captures, the blogger claims that it's Ukraine that has been stopped across all areas of the front. The past 24 hours have shown that the armed forces of Ukraine's assault corps not only failed to achieve the successes it needed, but it's also clearly no longer capable of serious counter-offensive actions, Stewart quotes the military blogger as claiming, even as yet more villages were liberated. The losses they suffered earlier are taking their toll, and the units of the Russian armed forces were clearly prepared and were able to impose their own counterplay. Really, Yuri, that's what you're going with. This is the exact opposite of what is going on, and as Stewart points out, Podolyaka's claims even contradict those being made by his fellow Russian military bloggers. A touch of projection seems to be going on here. Either that, or Podolyaka has wrongly assessed what Ukraine has done over the past week, as though it's some sort of massive counter-offensive, akin to the one seen during the summer of 2023, that is supposed to retake vast swathes of territory. It isn't. Ukraine is far too smart to sacrifice tens of thousands of soldiers to something like that, and it has a much more important plan in mind for the territory that it's liberated. That plan can be summed up in one word: stabilization. What Ukraine is doing with this entire counter-offensive is setting up so that it's prepared for what will come later in 2026. As Euromaidan Press notes, Ukraine has very cleverly limited its offensives to the tactical zone, otherwise known as the grey zone, where fighting was ongoing. In a sense, Podolyaka is right when he says that Ukraine isn't able to consolidate the gains that it's made to allow for a much deeper push into Zaporizhia. Konstantin Mashevets, whose assessments are cited by the Institute for the Study of War, says the same thing, only in Mashevets' case, he understands that Ukraine isn't trying to consolidate, it's looking to stabilize some of the most chaotic areas of the Zaporizhia front. Why? Well, Russia is preparing for another offensive in the summer of 2026. Ukraine's main goal right now is to disrupt the Russian timeline for that offensive, upon which Mashevets reported on February 5th. Anything that Ukraine can do to push that offensive back in terms of when it's launched reduces the window of opportunity that Putin's forces will have to take territory when the weather in Ukraine is favorable. Summer brings with it solid terrain, tree cover, and the ability to operate at night without risking hypothermia, and Ukraine wants to ensure that it's ready for the push that will come when conditions favor a Russian offensive. The ISW reports that part of the Russian summer offensive will focus on the Orikhiv-Zaporizhia city direction, which is why Russia has spent months trying to capture the territory that Ukraine has retaken over the past week. The Kyiv Post adds that Russia intends to dedicate 100,000 soldiers to this offensive, which will likely be pulled from the country's strategic reserves. Putin has set harsh deadlines for the assaults in the Zaporizhia region, and it's now almost impossible for Russia to meet those deadlines ahead of the summer. The lost territory needs to be retaken to make the offensive possible at the scale Putin wants, so the coming months would have been spent on preparations and making deeper advances, now have to be spent doing the exact same thing that Russia thought it had achieved months ago. Russia now finds itself in a catch-22 situation. On the one hand, it doesn't want to use the strategic reserves that it's been trying to build since 2025 to retake the territory that Ukraine had liberated. Those reserves are supposed to be dedicated to the summer offensive, so the more that Putin pulls from that particular pool, the less effective Russia's upcoming offensive will be. But on the other hand, leaving the liberated territory in Ukraine's hands means that the foothold that Russia needed to launch that offensive in the first place has crumbled away. The summer would end up being spent trying to retake the lost territory before any further advances can be made, which destroys Putin's agenda of using captured territory as leverage in peace talks. Forcing a humiliating Russian retreat like this is a masterstroke from Ukraine. However, as we mentioned earlier in the video, Ukraine's overall strategy of stabilizing the front lines doesn't mean that it is completely done with taking territory back from Russia just yet. According to Stewart, the village of Uspanivka may be Ukraine's next objective. That would make sense. The village is the center of the Russian defensive setup, which likely means that it's a logistical node through which other Russian assaults deeper into Zaporizhia are channeled. Taking that defensive setup weakens Russia even further, which will make it even harder for Putin to achieve the gains that he is looking for during the summer. The loss of Uspanivka would be especially painful for Russia, as it has occupied the settlement since early November 2025, and it had been using it to block Ukrainian units fighting in the Novomykolaiivka region. So we may see one more Ukrainian push toward Uspanivka, but that would likely be it for the counteroffensive. Once that settlement is taken, Ukraine will switch its focus to doing what it needs to do to prepare for the summer. What we're really seeing here is Ukraine taking the grey zone question out of the equation. The concept of grey zones is fairly new, and it's come to prominence during the Ukraine war in the wake of Russia's infiltration tactics. Prior to this war, the idea of combat lines was fairly solidified. Each side would set up defenses across a stable line, with assaults being organized to push that line forward or back, depending on whether the assault was carried out by an occupier or defender. But in Ukraine, the combat lines have been blurred. Grey zones, often spanning miles, have been created in which neither side can lay a legitimate claim to a piece of territory because both are operating within it. For instance, a Russian unit that infiltrates behind the combat lines could bed down in a portion of territory that Ukraine's drones still patrol. That territory hasn't been captured by Russia in this instance. At best, Russia has a foothold that will be destroyed as soon as the infiltrators are discovered. What the creation of these grey zones does for Russia is allow it to sow the seeds of chaos in the Ukrainian rear, which then forces Ukraine to do things like dedicate assault troops to the counterattacks that we've seen in the week leading up to February 26th. As effective as those counterattacks have been, Ukraine would prefer not to be dealing with grey zones. It wants stable lines and full control over territory because those two things allow for the creation of fortifications. And that's what we're likely to see next from Ukraine, both before and in the wake of the seemingly intended liberation of Uspanivka. As Euronews points out, Russia was already struggling to capture the staging points it needed for its summer offensive. Ukraine has just taken several of those potential points away with its stunning counteroffensive. Now, those liberated territories are going to be fortified and turned into defensive nodes that will shred through the Russian soldiers that attempt to reoccupy them. As a result of all of this, the front line as we know it is moving further away from Zaporizhia, Stewart reports. With that movement comes the ability for Ukraine to reinforce existing fortifications and potentially set up kill zones in the liberated territories. All of this will help Ukraine to attrit Russia's forces during the summer, forcing Russia to pay a hefty price in blood to occupy the territory that Putin and his cronies thought that they already held. These kill zones, which are all across the front line and can extend for as far as 15 kilometers or 9.3 miles, will force Russia's infiltrators to place their lives in Ukrainian hands every time they try to take a single step forward. A drone could always be watching. And now Ukraine has a network of over a dozen settlements, and maybe more to come, that it can transform into a brutal kill zone that will rip Russia apart in the summer, even wider than Ukraine just ripped it apart with its Zaporizhia counteroffensive. What we see here is the brilliance of Ukraine's war strategy. It has liberated territory to advance a genius approach to combating Russia that sees it using drones and modernized military systems to inflict massive casualties.
It was quiet, powerful, crippling. A secret move pulled off by Ukraine inside Russia itself that shattered Putin's entire war strategy for 2025. Ukraine pulled off a pair of offensives in Russia, along with one in the occupied territories of Ukraine that were never announced but had a huge impact on Putin's war plan. The secret offensive stopped Russia from claiming Donetsk, and it set the stage for something much bigger that we're now starting to see on the Ukrainian battlefield. Putin's plan for 2025 was simple. Under the smokescreen of peace talks that he never intended to honor, Putin would launch a massive summer offensive with two key goals. The first of those goals was to take the city of Pokrovsk in the Donetsk Oblast. With that city under Russia's control, Putin believed it would only be a matter of time before the rest of Donetsk region fell. Second, Russia sought to establish a buffer zone in the Sumy Oblast, potentially extending into the Kharkiv Oblast to prevent a repeat of Ukraine's counter-incursion into Kursk. August 2024 had seen Ukraine take around 390 square miles of territory in that oblast, and it had cost Russia 80,000 soldiers to take it back. The plan was in place. Take Pokrovsk and protect the Russian border regions. Ukraine crippled those plans with a trio of secret offensives, two of which took place on Russia's own turf. The other stopped Russia from taking Pokrovsk and has left Putin scrambling to maintain the myth of the inevitability of Russia's victory. February 6th saw Oleksandr Syrsky, who is the commander-in-chief of Ukraine's armed forces, reveal what Ukraine had done during the early stages of 2025 to stop the Russian war strategy in its tracks. In 2025, Ukraine's defense forces conducted 3 offensive operations, 2 of them on Russian territory in the Belgorod region and the Kursk region. The third operation took place in the Drobopilia direction, Syrsky claimed. In other words, Ukraine switched from defense to offense. Knowing what Putin had planned, it forced Russia's president to pump the brakes by hitting Russia hard in 3 strategic locations, thus guaranteeing that the summer offensive would fail to achieve its objectives. That offensive failed. We'll get into what that meant for Russia in a few moments. First, Syrsky says that the trio of secret Ukrainian operations took place in Kursk, Belgorod and Drobopilia. According to Euromaidan Press, Syrsky also said that none of these operations were announced publicly. Though Syrsky doesn't reveal exactly what Ukraine did to hurt Russia's 2025 plans as badly as it did, there are reports about all 3 of the regions that he mentions that offer hints. Let's start with Kursk. By the end of 2024, it seemed like Ukraine's counter-incursion into Kursk was over. Russia had amassed a force of around 50,000 soldiers, including somewhere in the region of 10,000 to 12,000 North Korean troops, to push Ukraine back out. The operation has largely been a success for Russia, albeit at the massive cost that we mentioned earlier in the video. But what most people don't know was that Ukraine didn't disappear from Kursk entirely in 2025. In fact, the beginning of the year saw Ukraine launch a surprise offensive in the region that caught Russia off guard, and according to The Guardian, appeared likely to have been launched to catch the eye of the then incoming US President Donald Trump. Videos were published by Russian channels showing Ukrainian armor moving in what those channels called a carousel to shuttle infantry into the Kursk region. Specifically, Ukrainian armored columns were pictured advancing across the snow-covered fields of a village called Bolshoye Soldatskoye, which is to the northeast of the town of Sudzha, which Ukraine took during its initial Kursk offensive. The Guardian reported that 42 combat clashes had taken place in Kursk on January the 5th alone, with 12 being ongoing at the time of the outlet's report. About a month after The Guardian's report, Euronews added that Ukrainian forces had managed to advance about 5 kilometers, or around 3.1 miles, into Kursk, primarily using the Sudzha-Obion highway to move forward. And Ukraine even managed to capture a handful of villages in the direction of Ulanok and Cherkasskia Konopelka. Euronews reported at the time that the Institute for the Study of War had found no evidence that Ukraine's forces had reached Ulanok. But perhaps that wasn't the point. If this early 2025 offensive was indeed the secret offensive that Syrskyi is hinting at, capturing the territory that Ukraine had lost in Kursk likely wasn't the real goal. Remember that Russia intended to use the summer to create a buffer zone in the Sumy and potentially the Kharkiv oblasts. Think about how Russia would have created that buffer zone. It had already amassed tens of thousands of soldiers inside Kursk to drive Ukraine out. Clear logic would have been for the remnants of that massive force to move into Sumy and Kharkiv after Ukraine had been cleared out of Kursk, with that force then bedding to allow Russia to funnel more forces into the Kursk direction over time. Ukraine launching an offensive in January would have thwarted those plans. After all, soldiers who were being forced to once again fight off a Ukrainian advance in Kursk would no longer be able to send to Sumy or Kharkiv to create the buffer zone. Ukraine could also use this second wave of offensives to further attrit Russia's forces in Kursk, meaning that any that did eventually make it over the border into Sumy or Kharkiv would be exhausted and likely become easy prey for Ukraine's defenses in those regions. There's one thing that we know for sure: no stable buffer zone exists in Ukraine. This early 2025 Kursk operation set the stage for the collapse of Russia's summer buffer strategy before it ever got off the ground. Stick with us, as we'll be explaining how Ukraine's genius counteroffensives had a huge impact on Putin's Pokrovsk plans in just a few minutes. Before that, we also need to talk about Belgorod. And like Kursk, Belgorod is a Russian border region that Putin knows is vulnerable to Ukraine's offensives. The buffer zone that Russia intended to create would have protected Belgorod as much as it would Kursk, which brings us to the second secret offensive that Syrskyi mentions. Again, Syrskyi hasn't revealed any details about this offensive. However, what seems most likely is that he's referring to what Ukraine did toward the end of March 2025 and into April. On March 23rd, Newsweek reported that Russia's offensive in Ukraine had stalled amidst Ukraine launching a counterattack into the Belgorod region. At this point, the outlet says Ukraine had pulled back from the Kursk region, which lies just to the west of Belgorod. It appears that the forces that launched the renewed offensives into Kursk earlier in 2025 were redeployed into Belgorod, which created a whole new range of problems for Russia. With Kursk freed up, Russia would have theoretically been able to send its troops into Sumy and Kharkiv to set up the buffer zone that Putin wanted. Instead, Ukraine's incursion into Belgorod would have once again diverted those Russian soldiers, forcing them east into Belgorod to deal with yet another Ukrainian assault designed to attrit them. What makes these March attacks seem like the most likely of the secret offensives that Syrskyi references is that Ukraine didn't confirm them at the time. As Newsweek notes, it was Russia that claimed that Ukraine had carried out cross-border attacks in Belgorod, with the attacks reportedly being focused on the villages of Pralesia and Demidovka, which are a little south of Kursk. Russia said that Ukraine had attacked these villages with 200 soldiers and 5 tanks, leading to Russian military bloggers stating that Ukraine had successfully stretched Russia's forces with the incursion. Russia, of course, claimed to have destroyed the Ukrainian offensive. Now it seems like that wasn't the case. It wouldn't be until April 1st that the Kyiv Independent reported on comments made by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky that confirmed the presence of Ukrainian troops in the Belgorod region. The outlet said that the incursion was focused on alleviating the pressure on Ukrainian troops still fighting in Kursk. Ukraine was using mechanized attacks, probably as described by Russia, along with engineering vehicles that cleared obstacles and mines standing in the way of its soldiers entering Belgorod. In general, it doesn't look like any gains Ukraine has made have been very significant in terms of territory taken, said the deputy director of the Russian program at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, John Hardy. However, as with the Kursk incursion, gaining territory wasn't the point. Ukraine was holding Russia up. it was disrupting the plans that Putin had developed for the summer by destroying as many of Russia's soldiers in the border regions as possible. The weaker the force that was left over, the less chance that Russia would have of creating the buffer zone that Putin had mandated. As we see today, Ukraine's secret strategy worked perfectly. Every plan that Putin had for Sumy and Kharkiv collapsed. Quick side note, you're watching The Military Show, and we always bring you the full picture. Hit subscribe to look beyond the headlines and stay ahead of the curve. With that, we head all the way back to Pokrovsk and the third of the offensives that Syrskyi mentions. Unlike the two that we've already covered, this third offensive didn't occur on Russian territory. It happened on the territory that Russia had stolen from Ukraine. Still, that does mean that Ukraine pulled off another offensive operation both against and behind the combat lines, and this one was very important. But hold on a second. We keep saying Pokrovsk, but the offensive that Syrskyi mentions was in Dobropilya. It was indeed, and that's why it mattered. Dobropilya may not be Pokrovsk, but it is part of the Pokrovsk Raion, which is a term that is roughly equivalent to Pokrovsk district. Specifically, Dobropilya is about 22 kilometers or about 13.6 miles north of Pokrovsk, which is why Russia wanted it. With control over Dobropilya, Russia would hold a settlement that gave it a springboard for further offensives against Pokrovsk. Plus, Russia would gain access to the Dobropilya-Kramatorsk highway in Donetsk, allowing it to push on to another of the key cities in the region that Putin needs to take before he can claim Donetsk. By early August of 2025, Russia's military had managed to capture several small settlements in the Dobropilya direction, including Vesely, Kucherov Yar, and Zolotilyi Koledyaz. It was also pushing to get across the Dobropilya-Kramatorsk highway so it could establish a foothold in the settlements of Novovodina and Petrivka. If Putin's forces weren't stopped at this point, that would likely have cleared a path toward Dobropilya and then on to Pokrovsk. So Ukraine took action. On August the 11th, which is the very same day as the Kyiv Independence Report, Ukraine launched its offensive into Dobropilya. The offensive lasted until the end of November, and it succeeded in reversing many of the gains that Russia had made, thus returning the status quo that had existed in the Dobropilya sector at the beginning of the summer. Just 3 days after the launch of the offensive, Ukraine's General Staff spokesperson, Andrei Kovalyov, was claiming that Ukraine had stopped the Russian advance and stabilized the Dobropilya situation. The sending of the formidable 1st Azov Corps played a role, as that unit worked alongside others in the direction of Dobropilya to stop the Russian advance in its tracks. Then the reversal started. By August 17th, Ukraine had reclaimed several of the settlements Russia had spent the last few weeks taking along the Dobropilya-Kramatorsk highway. Fast forward to the end of September, and Syrskyi said that the Ukrainian offensive had been so successful that it resulted in Ukraine reclaiming 175 square kilometers, or about 67.5 square miles of territory that Russia had occupied in the Dobropilya sector. Months of gains have been reversed, and as Syrskyi also reported, thanks to the well-planned and courageous actions of our troops, some enemy units have become encircled. Finally, on November the 29th, the commander of the air assault forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Lieutenant General Oleg Apostol, appeared on Ukrainian television to announce the end of the Dobropilya offensive. Ukraine's objective was completed. The Russian occupiers had been pushed out of Dobropilya, and as for Pokrovsk, which is what Putin really wanted to gain from all of this, Apostol had this to say. Pokrovsk is holding. Our units are in Pokrovsk, and certain areas are already under our control. I don't think the enemy will be reporting that they have fully captured it, and that won't happen anytime soon. Well, it still hasn't happened. The summer offensive officially failed at this point, assuming we're giving Putin enough grace to have carried that offensive over into November. And with that, a trio of Ukrainian offensives was completed, and Moscow's entire war plan for 2025 had been shattered. So what did the summer actually deliver to Putin? Well, Russia failed to create stable buffer zones in Sumy or Kharkiv. The offensives in Kursk and Belgorod ensured that by stretching Russia's already ragged troops even further. By the time those offensives were over, Russia essentially had nothing that it could use to create any buffer zones. Even now, Russia is testing Ukraine's borders with assaults. On February the 8th, it was reported that Russian losses were equivalent to nearly 2 battalions in just 24 hours to these assaults, which shows just how well the buffer plan went. As for Pokrovsk, it still stands, even though Russia has falsely claimed to have captured it. Ukraine is gradually pulling back from the city, as Colonel Volodymyr Polevyi, who is in the head of communications for Ukraine Air Assault Forces, 7th Rapid Response Corps, revealed on February the 7th. But that pullback is tactical, intelligent. For every inch that Russia is gaining in the Pokrovsk direction, it is spilling enormous amounts of its military's blood. Think back to what Ukraine did in Kursk and Belgorod earlier in 2025. It attacked, then withdrew, leaving Russia's forces so shattered that they couldn't create buffer zones. Something similar is happening in Pokrovsk. Russia may still claim the city, but but by the time it has, its Pokrovsk forces will be running on fumes ahead of having to face up to the fortress belt of cities in Donetsk that present an even bigger challenge than Pokrovsk ever did. And just in case you didn't catch it, February the 7th isn't the summer of 2025. Pokrovsk has held on for at least 6 months longer than it was supposed to, and Russia's forces have died in droves trying to take it. In a moment, we're going to tell you that what Ukraine did in 2025 may well have set the stage for what it has been doing during the early stages of 2026. But before we do, here's what the failure of Russia's summer offensive, as caused by Ukraine's 3 secret offensives, really did. Per the Atlantic Council, the failure of Putin's summer offensive should now help to debunk the persistent myth of inevitable Russian victory. For far too long, international perceptions of the war in Ukraine have been distorted by exaggerated notions of Russia's military might, the Council says. That perception is gone. Russia now looks weaker in the eyes of the world than it has since the start of Putin's Ukraine invasion. Putin's myth-making has been revealed as the sham that it always was, which means that Russia is increasingly struggling to control the international response to its invasion. It's failure within failure. Ukraine's trio of offensives collapsed Russia's 2025 war plans for Ukraine, and on the broader scale, they also destroyed Putin's plot to influence the international community. Now, let's come back to what we're seeing in Ukraine in the aftermath of the collapse of Putin's plans. The trio of secret offensives was just the beginning. As Syrskyi revealed on February the 6th, Ukrainian offensives now account for about a quarter of the clashes that occur across the entire front line. Would that have been possible without Ukraine's actions in 2025? It seems unlikely. Russia's forces have been sufficiently weakened that Ukraine is now able to launch yet more offensives that it aims to use to retake territory that Russia has claimed. If all goes as Ukraine hopes, it could end up reversing many of the gains that Putin's forces made in 2025, making the entire year even more disastrous and some would argue pointless than it already was. These tactics are yielding results, is all that Syrskyi would say of Ukraine's renewed offensives, as he pointed out that Russia had experienced no significant operational successes in January. The point here is that Russia isn't free to simply attack at will anymore. Its forces are now under constant pressure, leading to Ukraine inflicting yet more losses that prevent further advances by the occupiers. Ukraine is succeeding far more often than not. Its soldiers come out on top in 90% of the instances where they take part in small arms engagements against Russia's forces. Ukraine's drones are also out in force, and they managed to score an insane kill count of over 30,000 Russian troops, with all of those deaths being verified on Ukraine's Delta system. Ukraine is also working on bolstering the strength and quality of its soldiers. It has introduced the 6th edition of its training program, which extends basic training for soldiers to 51 days, in addition to offering an adaptation period of 14 days. The takeaway from this is that Ukraine's new soldiers enter the battlefield ready to fight against Russian recruits who go through minimal training and have essentially been thrown to the wolves. As for Russia, it's planning on making the same mistakes that it did in 2025. Another planned summer offensive has been announced, though this one seems more of a power play made by Putin to try to manipulate the public's perception of what Russia is actually capable of. The truth, according to the Institute for the Study of War, is that Russia is in no position to launch another summer offensive, and certainly not one of the scale seen in the failed offensive of 2025. The Russian military likely lacks sufficient reserves to both adequately prepare for such an offensive and achieve the offensive's objectives, the Institute says. Typical Russia. Putin's only strategy is to keep banging the Russian head on the Ukrainian wall, hoping that the next bang will be the one that breaks Ukraine. Well, instead, Russia's ears are bleeding. Its collective head is ringing, and it has ruined itself to the point that Ukraine is launching yet more offensives. The trio of secret offensives in 2025 was just the appetizer. This year, Ukraine plans to shove the main course right down Putin's throat. Russia is in checkmate, so much so that not even the maneuver warfare tactics that enable it to make gains in Ukraine early in the war are helping. Russia has no tanks, and Putin's preferred style of war is finished.
It's the Russian way of war. Death is to be expected, often on a massive scale. But in the end, the attritional strategy pays dividends and the enemy collapses. That time-tested strategy has been employed by Vladimir Putin ever since he invaded Ukraine. But it's not working. Putin's strategy to outlast Ukraine has blown up in his face, and his last hope that the West would abandon Ukraine has disappeared. There are two sides to this story: what Putin was hoping for and what is actually happening to Russia right now. Throw a wild card into the mix and a plan that once seemed so certain in Putin's mind has crumbled. We'll come to the wild card and what's really happening soon. First, there's what Putin hoped for. In a January 16th interview with the Times Radio's The Trump Report, the founder of the Magnitsky Justice Campaign, Bill Browder, laid it all out. And so what Putin is hoping for is that even though he's suffering unbelievable casualties, and we're talking about 1,000 Russian soldiers are being killed every day, but what he's hoping for is that we're going to tire before he does, Browder says. The we in his statement is the collective West, and Browder is suggesting that Putin believes that his winning strategy is no longer to attrit the Ukrainian forces on the battlefield, it's simply to keep pushing, projecting false power all the way, until the West withdraws the support that he feels is key to Ukraine's survival. Browder continues, adding, "And even if we only experience 1/100th of the pain in our democracies and our free media, and so on, we're all, tying ourselves up in knots and knots saying, well, should we be carrying on supporting Ukraine?" That is Putin's big gamble, in that the seemingly never-ending flow of Russian forces into Ukraine will eventually lead to Ukraine's allies throwing in the towel. It's resources versus willpower. Putin is betting that the latter will fail for the West before the former fails for Russia. Not that Putin isn't hedging his bets a little. As he grows more desperate to see his strategy through to the end, Russia's president has been making some token claims that he hopes will appease Ukraine's European allies. For instance, December 2025 saw Putin claim that any thought that Russia would attack another European country is nonsense. All that those countries have to do, Putin said during a 4.5-hour televised address, is to respect Russia. There won't be any operations if you treat us with respect, if you respect our interests just as we've always tried to respect yours, Putin said when answering a question from the BBC about his so-called special military operation. Respect, in this case, means let us do what we want in Ukraine and we won't have any trouble. Putin doesn't seem to realize that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is the very reason why the collective West has been so steadfast in its support for the nation so far. You could take these words as an attempt to schmooze those in Europe who might argue that the Ukraine war has dragged on too long and that it's draining their country's resources. Again, that's what Putin hopes, and he has reason to believe that his strategy could work. To some, the West's collective response to Putin's Ukraine invasion was underwhelming from the off, and it's only now approaching the levels that it should have been 4 years ago. One of the people who shares that opinion is Bohdan Nihilo, who wrote a piece for the Kyiv Post on January 17th, in which he argued that delays in appeasement are the reason for why Russia has been able to launch a winter campaign of airstrikes that have left thousands of Ukrainians without electricity and heating. Nihilo brings up air defenses, which Ukraine has pleaded many times over the years. These requests were met with hesitation, delays, and political concerns about escalation. Western leaders, especially in Washington, worried about provoking Moscow and appearing too involved. They sent javelins and HIMARS, which helped but could not stop the constant attacks from Russian missiles and drones launched from afar, Nihilo argues. He may have a point. To Putin, the fact that the West, particularly the US, was so hesitant to risk escalation of the war means that he may still have an in. Just keep it up, is Putin's current mantra. The West will stay scared and it will eventually relent, and when it does, Ukraine will be there for the taking. Of course, the threats, cajoling, and even the attempts at soothing the very fears that Putin created all serve an ulterior motive. We see that in Putin's approach to peace talks. In November, the Atlantic Council noted that for all of his talk of a supposed peace, Putin has done nothing but escalate his efforts to erase Ukraine. The outlet highlights what Russia has been doing in the occupied regions of Ukraine, where it claims that a reign of terror is in place against the civilians in Ukraine's south and east. Ukrainian symbols of statehood, heritage, and culture are being erased and replaced with a campaign of Russification of a state that escaped the former Soviet yoke over 3 decades ago. Putin doesn't want peace. He wants Europe to go back to the way it was when he prowled the halls of the KGB. That means any claims that he will stop at Ukraine have to be taken with a grain of salt so big that it would cause your blood pressure to skyrocket. The strategy now is the same as it's always been: outlast the enemy. Only the new twist is that Putin seems to increasingly see the West, and Europe in particular, as the enemy he needs to outlast rather than Ukraine. The West throwing in the towel is Putin's dream scenario. There's also a chance, no matter how small, that the wild card we'll get to later in the video could help him make that dream a reality. However, what we're seeing in most of the West is that Putin's plan has crumbled. Far from backing away from supporting Ukraine, many of Ukraine's strongest allies are only taking more steps to reinforce their support. This is what we've seen from January 2026 alone. On January 16th, Ukraine and the UK marked the first anniversary of their historic 100-year partnership, which was put in place to send a clear message to Putin that the UK will support Ukraine's sovereignty for long after Russia's president is gone. A pledge of £20 million, or about $26.99 million, was made to help support Ukraine's flagging energy security on the same date, making this at least one seemingly rock-solid partnership with which Putin can't meddle. Just 10 days before that anniversary, the Paris Declaration was revealed. This declaration is essentially an agreement between the UK, the US, and the Coalition of the Willing, which is being spearheaded by the UK and France, to provide strong security guarantees for Ukraine once the war ends. In addition to pledging a multinational force, backed by a proposed US-led ceasefire verification and monitoring mechanism, the declaration also saw the coalition declare its continued support for Ukraine's armed forces and claim it would make binding commitments in terms of how it would respond in the event of a future Russian invasion. Again, the message was sent. The West is actively working toward a future where Ukraine exists, which is the opposite of what Putin's strategy is supposed to achieve. There have also been more tangible examples that the West isn't willing to let Putin have everything his own way. January has seen Ukraine's allies seize 3 of Russia's Shadow Fleet vessels. The first 2 of those seizures occurred during the first week of the year as US forces boarded and detained both the Marinera and MT Sofia. These ships had links to Venezuela, where the US recently completed an operation to capture the now former dictatorial president Nicolas Maduro. More recently, France, with a helping hand from the UK, seized another Shadow Fleet vessel in the Mediterranean. The Grinch, which feels like such an apt name for a Russian ship, was boarded, examined, and then taken for further examination. Declarations and partnerships act as the paper proof that the West still supports Ukraine. The seizing of oil tankers is much more of a physical reminder of the fact that this support is strong in the present as well as hypothetically strong in the future. Ukraine will hope that these kinds of Shadow Fleet seizures will continue and perhaps even escalate. Browder says whether they will or not is dependent on what Trump is saying to the likes of French President Emmanuel Macron and the UK's Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer. In one sense, by him, Trump, going after the Venezuelan Shadow Fleet, which happens to also overlap with the Russian Shadow Fleet, Putin again, he's being humiliated, Browder declares. On the other hand, we don't hear any announcements of Trump taking over and boarding Shadow Fleet boats belonging to Russia that have nothing to do with Venezuela, he adds. The US Shadow Fleet support may well be conditional on whether it benefits the United States in its current policies or not. Putin will look at all of these examples of the support that he wishes to erode that have occurred in just over 3 weeks of the new year and see that his grand strategy isn't working out the way he wanted. Remember, this strategy is all about attrition, Russian resources versus Western willpower, as we said earlier. The Western willpower seems to still be strong, but what will really be hurting Putin, and what he may never have expected, is that a strategy that focused on Russian resource strength has ignored the impact the Ukraine war is having on Russia's people. That impact is pronounced, damaging, and it's sending Russia closer to the abyss with each passing day. Let's start with Ukraine's own contributions to the attempted shutdown of the Shadow Fleet. Now, there is one person who is dealing with the Shadow Fleet in his own special way, and that's Volodymyr Zelensky, Browder says, before adding, and he is systematically immobilizing these ships as they sail into the Black Sea, and sometimes doing it outside of the Black Sea. Indeed, Ukraine's own campaign against the Shadow Fleet seems to have been more effective than that of its allies so far. Toward the end of November, Ukrainian strike drones targeted a pair of Russian oil tankers that were attempting to sail through the Black Sea. Several months before that, the Kyiv Post reported that Ukraine had conducted a series of about half a dozen surgical strikes against Black Sea vessels, with many of those strikes taking place in international waters or ports. There have been other attacks since, but Ukraine has shown that it's more than capable of doing what its allies won't or can't with these strikes. Again, it's attrition. A Shadow Fleet ship that can't sail is a ship that Russia can't use to sell its oil. Speaking of oil, Ukraine has also been attacking the Shadow Fleet indirectly by targeting Russian oil facilities en masse. 2025 saw Ukraine massively accelerate the campaign of long-range strikes against Russia's oil refineries and infrastructure. The effects of this campaign were remarkable. In November, the Bloomsbury Intelligence and Security Institute, or BISI, noted that about 55% of Russia's refineries had been targeted by Ukraine since its first strike against a refinery in June 2022. However, 2025 was the banner year so far. Ukraine managed to shut down around 20% of Russia's refining capacity, and it carried out 48% more successful strikes against refineries in that year than it did in 2024, BISI claims. There's a pretty simple logic behind this strategy. BISI points out that about 30% of Russia's annual budget comes from its oil and gas sales. Right now, that budget contribution is being propped up by the Shadow Fleet. So the logic goes that Ukraine and its Western allies take out Shadow Fleet vessels by strikes or seizures, while Ukraine also attacks the product that those vessels are transporting, leading to other vessels in the Shadow Fleet becoming useless by default. An extra layer added to these refinery strikes is that Ukraine has also been hitting crude oil storage facilities and, in the case of its January strikes in the Caspian Sea, Russian oil drilling rigs. These attacks have led to Russia's supply of crude oil to its refineries being the lowest that it's been for 15 years, per a January 20th article by oilprice.com. Crude processing rates also declined by 1.7% in 2025 compared to the previous year, which is a natural outcome of less crude oil being available. Russia claims unscheduled maintenance as the reason behind these declines. That's a nice way of saying, our crude oil facilities are burning because of Ukraine. If you're starting to wonder how all of these oil issues link back to Putin's strategy of causing Western support for Ukraine to diminish, it's all about Ukraine showcasing that it has the will to fight. Willpower, again, is Putin's undoing. What he's trying to frame as a hopeless battle for Ukraine in the collective Western mind is actually a war that is costing Russia so dearly that it's clear that with continued support, it will end up being Ukraine that outlasts Russia. Furthermore, what's happening to Russian oil is an example of Putin slowly losing one of the resources he needs for his attritional strategy to work out. Oil is far from the only resource that he's losing. As Browder notes, the sheer scale of death that Russia's military has seen inflicted upon its own is an example of yet another resource being drained. Putin has sent, according to Ukrainian statistics, somewhere around 1.2 million young men who have either been killed or permanently disabled through this war, Browder says. That's a lot of people. I mean, that's an unimaginable amount of people, he adds. Ukraine's Ministry of Finance backs this number and even says that it has risen to above 1.23 million since Browder's interview. Privately, Browder suggests many people in Russia must be thinking that the rampant death being inflicted on their countrymen has to stop, if only to ensure that there will be any Russians left after the end of Putin's war. Those same people are also being forced to deal with the impact of the brutality to which Russia's soldiers are exposed. The Russian military cycles soldiers in and out of Ukraine, and it also has soldiers working under contracts that allow them to return home if they make it through their stints in Ukraine alive. Throw a bunch of men who've been exposed to the worst that humanity has to offer, often by their own commanders and comrades, and you get a situation where violent crime is on the rise in Russia. Browder suggests that this should be expected. Russia's returning soldiers have been trained, albeit often poorly, to kill and maim Ukrainians. They've also seen many of their friends and comrades destroyed on the battlefield. All of a sudden, these psychologically damaged people are, when they're done, if they're not killed in action, are then coming back and doing the same thing in Russia, Browder says. Look past the hyperbole and you see that Browder has a point. A December 2025 report in the Moscow Times says that returning Russian soldiers have been linked to over 1,000 killings and injuries during the 4 years that the Ukraine war has raged. Bear in mind that this statistic relates to the small number of soldiers who have returned so far. If the war were to end tomorrow, approximately 695,000 soldiers would come streaming back into the country. A percentage of those soldiers will bring their brutality back home. Ironically, this would lead to yet more manpower, which Putin considers a resource, being lost to death and injury on Russian soil. And despite all that Putin has spent and outright lost on his supposed special military operation, Ukraine still stands, as does the support of its allies. With his strategy collapsing around him, the only slight hope that Putin has left of outlasting Ukraine is the wild card that we mentioned at the start of the video. You may have already guessed what that wild card is: the United States, or more specifically, the Trump administration. Browder highlights the often contradictory nature of the US approach to Russia under Trump. On the one hand, he points to the US actions in Venezuela as a sign that the Trump administration isn't afraid to ruffle Putin's feathers if Russia is standing in the way of something the US wants. The American military operation to take Maduro was a spectacular success militarily for the Americans to be able to go in, completely immobilize all of their defenses, grab the dictator, the illegitimate dictator of a rogue regime, take him out, and not lose a single American life. That's the type of power that Putin wants, but 4 years of warfare have proven that he simply doesn't have it. So message sent, right? Not necessarily. On the other hand, Browder cites Trump's claims that the US should be granted control over Greenland. That's ammunition for Putin, Browder claims. If America wants to take Greenland, why is anyone giving us a hard time about Crimea or Ukraine? Browder says could easily become Putin's argument. It's unlikely that Trump intends to give Putin this sort of ammunition, as his focus appears to be on strengthening the US with his play for Greenland. Still, the elements of hypocrisy are there. Furthermore, the support that the Trump administration shows for Ukraine, such as the Shadow Fleet ship seizures, is often counterbalanced by Trump saying things that suggest he wants to keep Ukraine guessing. In mid-January, Trump pointed the finger squarely at Zelensky as the reason why a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia hadn't been reached. The Kremlin reacted quickly, with Putin's favorite mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, saying, "Here we can agree, it's really the case." Peskov speaks with Putin's words, so Russia's president may still have a glimmer of hope that his willpower versus resources strategy could work out for him in the end. But then there's always the problem with wild cards. You never know what they're going to do next. As long as the rest of the West, especially Ukraine's European allies, stand firm, the wildcard factor can be mitigated and Putin's final play for victory will fall short. After all, Putin is already in his endgame, even if he doesn't realize it yet. With his geopolitical influence collapsing, a raft of economic issues hurting Russia, and all of the issues we've just discussed lumped on top, Putin has put himself in a no-win situation, where only escalation without the hope of victory remains. Find out what all of that means in our video, and if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show for more insight into what's going on behind the Ukrainian battlefield. And thank you, as always, for watching.